Let's kick things off with perhaps the single most eyebrow-raising job title in Tudor history, the groom of the stool. No, it's not a fancy furniture polisher or a stool sample collector, although both might be preferable. This was the royal rear-end technician, the designated man in charge of helping the king go to the bathroom. Yes, you heard that right. The Tudor court took its bodily functions seriously. Imagine applying for a job where the official description includes the phrase intimate access to the monarch's buttocks, because that's what the groom of the stool did. He wiped. But before you imagine a man tragically armed with a roll of medieval toilet paper. Spoiler, it didn't exist. Let's back up and understand why this job wasn't just tolerated, it was revered. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic 10 things you didn't know about the Tudor era, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The logic, if we can call it that, was built on the principle that the king was God's chosen representative on earth. Therefore, anything the king did, even the, shall we say, earthy parts, had to be treated with reverence. So, if the king needed to relieve himself, it wasn't a private affair. It was a divine ritual, complete with attendants, velvet cushions, and yes, someone to manage the paperwork. Now, the stool in question was a portable toilet, essentially a fancy wooden chair with a hole in it, topped with a padded seat and a chamber pot underneath. The groom of the stool would carry it around wherever the king went, ready for emergency bowel movements at court or during royal travel. Think of him as a 16th century bathroom Uber, always on call, never late, and with terrifying job responsibilities. Here's where things get weird. Being this close to the king's business made you one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, because when you're literally the only person in the room during a king's most vulnerable moments, you hear things, secrets, whispers, confessions, court gossip, or just the king mumbling about who annoyed him during dinner. The groom of the stool often became a trusted advisor. He managed the king's schedule, handled private correspondence, and even influenced royal appointments. Why? Because kings trusted the man who helped them drop royal logs. It's hard to backstab someone who's seen you pantless. By the time of Henry VIII, the position had become so influential that nobles actually fought for it. Imagine noblemen lining up and saying things like, "Yes, your majesty, I too would be honored to dab your royal dignity." Henry's grooms of the stool, like Sir William Compton and Sir Anthony Denny, became power brokers behind the scenes, all thanks to their proximity to the porcelain wooden throne. Let's take a moment to reflect on how weird court life really was. If you were a Tudor nobleman, there were only a few ways to gain the king's trust. Marry into the right family, win a major battle, or get promoted to assistant poop handler, royal division. Your lineage could get you a seat in parliament, but your intimate bathroom relationship with the monarch, that could get you land, titles, and access to the highest levels of government. You didn't climb the life ladder, you wiped it. Even more bizarrely, this job was for men only, a sort of sacred male bonding ritual between monarch and servant. No women allowed, which frankly might have been a blessing in disguise. So what did one use to clean a Tudor king's behind? Great question, and one I bet you never thought you'd Google. There wasn't toilet paper. Instead, soft cloths, water, and sometimes even moss or wool were used. All of it was then disposed of, or if expensive enough, washed and reused. Yes, reused. Welcome to pre-industrial hygiene, and it wasn't a sloppy affair either. The process was ritualized. The groom wore fine robes like any other courtier, because nothing says prestige like wiping while wearing velvet and brocade. He also managed the linen inventory, aka butt napkins, inspected the cleanliness of the stool, and ensured the king's dignity was preserved at all times. Think of it as butler meets bidet. Many grooms went on to become knights, privy councillors, or even earls, which proves once again that in Tudor England, all roads to power were lined with chamber pots. If the king trusted you to take care of his most vulnerable moments, he trusted you with almost anything. And if you think this whole thing sounds undignified, remember, this job existed in some form for centuries. It didn't officially vanish until the reign of King Edward VII, when modern plumbing and personal dignity finally teamed up and said, let's not. So the next time you're questioning your own career path, just remember, in the 1500s, one of the best jobs in the land was wiping someone else's behind. And not just any someone, the actual King of England. Let's get one thing out of the way. If you were flashing a toothy grin in Tudor England, it probably meant one of two things. Either you were painfully optimistic or deeply unaware of what was happening inside your mouth, because Tudor dentistry wasn't just primitive, it was a horror story in slow motion, acted out in real time inside people's faces. There were no dental schools, no sterile tools, and certainly no Novocaine. The closest thing to dental anesthesia was either clenching a wooden spoon or fainting from sheer panic. Toothache? That wasn't a symptom. It was a prophecy of suffering to come. The best-case scenario was a neighbor yanking it out with pliers they also used on horses. Worst case, the infection spreads and you get a bonus trip to meet your maker, courtesy of an abscess gone rogue. To brush their teeth. Well, brush is a strong word. Tudors used frayed sticks, chewed until they split into bristly fibers. No minty freshness, no whitening foam, just enthusiastic gnawing. If you had a bit more coin, maybe you rubbed your teeth with cloth dipped in a paste made of crushed salt, soot, vinegar, or even burnt rosemary. You weren't brushing so much as sandblasting your enamel with a medieval smoothie of regret. And let's not forget the role of sugar. Tudor elites, flush with New World imports, developed a passionate relationship with sugar, a relationship that was deeply toxic. Henry VIII, the founding father of I have too many wives and too few molars, had a notorious sweet tooth. This was a man who consumed desserts the way modern humans inhale oxygen. His banquets were sugar-coated disasters, from candied fruit to elaborate sugar sculptures, so detailed they probably had dental insurance of their own. Naturally, Henry's royal chompers suffered. By the time he reached his later years, his teeth were so rotten and foul-smelling that courtiers reportedly avoided standing too close. And considering this was a man prone to screaming tantrums and chopping off heads, you'd have to assume the breath situation was serious if people were willing to risk offense over proximity. The decay wasn't subtle either. Teeth turned black, gums bled, cavities grew until they became what could only be described as oral voids. There are accounts of nobles walking around with toothaches that lasted months, choosing to endure the pain rather than risk the crude extractions available. One option was a barber surgeon, someone equally qualified to cut your hair and your jawbone. Imagine asking your stylist for a trim and leaving with a few fewer teeth than expected. If the barber wasn't available, you might turn to a local tooth drawer, a person whose qualifications were mostly defined by upper body strength and a lack of emotional connection to your pain. Their tools, metal pliers, tongs, or occasionally just their hands if they were feeling confident and you weren't holding still. They'd grip, twist, yank, and pray. And if the tooth broke halfway through, well, congratulations, you now had two problems. But the Tudors didn't just ignore the issue. They tried to fix it with what little they had. Mouthwashes were a thing, sort of. Recipes included rinses with wine, vinegar, or even urine. Yes, urine. Because apparently, if your gums were receding, the natural solution was to insult them further. There were also potions and poultices made from herbs, which either slightly helped or made your mouth smell like a garden had died inside it. Some wealthier individuals even attempted to use false teeth, though these were often made from animal bones or other people's teeth, typically from the mouths of the recently deceased. This gave rise to a delightful phenomenon known as graveyard dentures. Nothing says class like biting into your roast swan using someone else's molars. It wasn't just the physical suffering, it was the social implications. Rotten teeth were such a marker of wealth, since only the rich could afford the sugar that caused them. They actually became a fashion statement. People wanted their teeth to look bad. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly blackened her teeth artificially to match the upper-class decay trend, because in the Tudor era, Nothing said elegance like a mouth that resembled a burnt picket fence. The irony is that the poor, who couldn't afford sugar, usually had better teeth. Their diets were rough but simple: pottage, coarse bread, and basic vegetables. They didn't have access to fancy desserts, but they also didn't have their molars dissolving into syrupy oblivion. Of course, with no dental checkups, minor problems became lifelong curses. An impacted wisdom tooth didn't just make you cranky, it might have ruined your sleep, your ability to eat, and depending on infection, your remaining life expectancy. And this is in an era when people genuinely believed that tooth worms, yes, worms that lived in your teeth, were the cause of decay. As if the situation needed to be creepier. So if you ever catch yourself complaining about your dentist being a bit rough with the suction tube, just remember, in Tudor England the most you could hope for was someone strong enough to yank your tooth out in one go, and kind enough not to do it while laughing. Your breath wasn't bad. It was considered a weapon of war. If there were an Olympic event for most dramatic love life with the highest body count, Henry VIII would not only win the gold medal, he'd probably behead the silver and bronze contenders for good measure. This was a man who treated marriage less like a sacred bond and more like a reality show elimination round. 6 wives, 2 executions, 2 divorces, 1 death by natural causes, 1 actual survivor who probably woke up every day, just grateful her head was still attached. Now, Henry didn't set out to become England's most infamous husband. He started off as a charming, athletic Renaissance prince. He wrote music, he jousted, he spoke multiple languages, and then somewhere between wife 2 and wife 5, he turned into the historical equivalent of that guy who insists every breakup was totally the other person's fault. Let's break it down, lightning round style, because even Henry's therapist wouldn't have had time to keep up. Wife number 1, Catherine of Aragon, the starter marriage. Henry's first wife was actually his brother's widow. Awkward? A bit. But the Pope gave them the green light, and for 20 years they were considered a solid royal couple. The issue? No sons. Catherine gave birth multiple times, but only 1 daughter, Mary, survived. Henry, being a 16th century male with the emotional maturity of a spoon, panicked. He needed a male heir. Naturally, instead of adopting or considering that his sperm might be part of the problem, he decided God was punishing him for marrying his brother's wife. So he petitioned for a divorce. The Pope, probably holding his head in both hands, said no. So Henry shrugged, invented his own church, and divorced Catherine anyway. Religious revolution by way of midlife crisis. Wife 2, Anne Boleyn, the flirt who flipped England. Anne Boleyn didn't just catch Henry's eye, she set the man on fire. Intelligent, witty, and absolutely not interested in being his mistress, Anne played hard to get so successfully, she accidentally caused the English Reformation. Henry broke with Rome, married her, and crowned her queen. This, to be clear, was a huge deal. The man reshaped an entire religion just to upgrade from side piece to official wife. Unfortunately, Anne also failed to produce a male heir. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. But Henry was too busy sulking to notice. When Anne miscarried a son, Henry turned on her faster than a poisoned goblet at a court banquet. She was arrested, accused of adultery with several men including her own brother, and executed by sword. Not even axe, sword, imported from France. Classy. Wife No. 3, Jane Seymour. The brief and bittersweet. Jane Seymour came in like a calm after the storm. She was gentle, quiet, and most importantly fertile. She gave Henry the son he always wanted, Edward VI, and became the only wife he truly mourned, probably because she didn't live long enough to disappoint him. Jane died shortly after childbirth, and Henry had her buried beside him, proving that in the Tudor version of romance, the best thing you could do was die early. Wife Anne of Cleves, the blind date from hell. Anne of Cleves was chosen through what can only be described as the 1500s version of online dating. Henry saw a flattering portrait of her, painted by Hans Holbein, and was like, yes, I'd like to swipe right on that Duchess, please. When she arrived in person, Henry reportedly recoiled like someone had just offered him a gluten-free cake at a feast. He called her a Flanders mare and tried to cancel the wedding, but it was too late. They married, and 6 months later, they had the world's politest divorce. Anne got a generous settlement, a few castles, and kept her head. That's a win. Wife Nov 5, Catherine Howard, the teenage tragedy. Catherine Howard was young, beautiful, and absolutely not emotionally equipped to handle Henry, who by this time was bloated, ulcer-ridden, and generally grumpy. She made the fatal mistake of allegedly cheating on him with several men, both past and present. In a court full of spies, that was basically a death wish. She was arrested, tried, and beheaded at the Tower of London. Witnesses said she practiced placing her head on the block the night before her execution, because in Henry's court date night might include sharpening the axe. Wife 6, Catherine Parr, the survivor of VIII. Catherine Parr was Henry's final wife, and frankly, she deserved a trophy just for staying alive. She was intelligent, twice widowed, and managed to out-argue Henry on theology without getting burned at the stake. That's no small feat. She also played nursemaid as Henry's health declined, overseeing his care and maintaining a respectful silence on the whole "I've murdered several wives" situation. When Henry died, she didn't even flinch. She just remarried and moved on like a queen. So let's recap the marital carnage. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It sounds like a chant, or possibly a cautionary nursery rhyme to scare children into celibacy. But it was real. Henry's love life didn't just reshape England, it redefined monarchy, religion, and the entire structure of royal marriage, and he did it all while slowly turning into a gout-ridden paranoid meatball with a crown. Tinder would have blocked him. Medieval England just crowned him. Tudor fashion. The glittering parade of velvet, lace, and suspiciously large pouches attached to pants. But beneath the polished jewels and embroidered sleeves lurked something sinister, a calculated system of social status, body torture, and chemical warfare disguised as clothing. To look good in the 16th century, you didn't just suffer, you risked dying fashionably. Let's start with the ruff, the iconic neckpiece that screams, "I have money, and I'd like to suffocate while proving it." These stiff, starched collars began as simple fabric frills, but quickly evolved into disc-shaped choking hazards the size of satellite dishes. You couldn't turn your head, chew properly, or breathe without rustling like a medieval wind tunnel. Some were so large they required wire understructures and multiple servants to properly position them. Functionally useless but socially essential, ruffs let everyone know you were wealthy enough to spend hours being starched into submission. Next, we must address the corset, or as it was cheerfully known back then, the stays. Unlike later Victorian models, Tudor corsets were stiffened with materials like whalebone, wood, or sometimes hardened paste. The goal wasn't just a narrow waist, it was full bodily control. These things compressed your torso so thoroughly you could barely sit, eat, or exhale deeply without sounding like a dying accordion. The more uncomfortable you looked, the more elegant you were considered. Breathing was optional. Looking wealthy was not. Then there's the codpiece, a fashion trend that somehow screamed insecurity louder than any modern gym selfie. Originally invented to cover the awkward gap left between a doublet and hose, the codpiece evolved into a fabric monument to masculinity. Bold, bulbous, and often padded like a toddler's first football helmet. Some were decorative, some were storage compartments, yes really, and all were statements. The bigger the codpiece, the more you were trying to overcompensate for something, or perhaps everything, but the real killer sometimes literally was the dye. Tudor nobles loved vibrant colors, deep crimson, royal purple, rich emerald, all signs that you weren't a turnip-munching peasant. But getting those colors required toxic ingredients, mercury, arsenic, and lead among them. That glorious green sleeve, it might slowly poison you through your sweaty armpits. That dazzling red lining, made from crushed insects and dipped in dye that could cause blistering. And let's not forget the makeup face powder laced with white lead. a recipe that turned your skin porcelain perfect before it flaked off like drywall in a rainstorm. Nothing says elite like dying from your own wardrobe. Of course, all of this wasn't just personal taste, it was law. Literally, Tudor England operated under a strict set of sumptuary laws which dictated who could wear what. These laws were created not only to maintain social hierarchy, but also to prevent anyone from dressing above their station. In other words, if your outfit looked too fancy for your income level, you could be fined or worse. For example, only royals and certain nobles could wear purple silk. Want a fancy fur trim on your coat? You'd better be at least an earl. Dreaming of gold embroidery? Not unless you own half of Yorkshire. Even sleeve widths were regulated, because apparently wide sleeves were a threat to social stability. Heaven forbid a merchant looked too majestic while buying onions. Violating these fashion laws wasn't just frowned upon, it was considered a direct challenge to the social order. The clothing police, yes they existed, would fine, publicly shame, or in some cases imprison people for fashion crimes. Imagine going to jail because your hat had too many feathers. In Tudor England, that wasn't a joke, it was an actual Tuesday, and if you were poor, your clothing options ranged from brown to dirt. Most commoners wore garments made from coarse wool or linen, often undyed and reeking of whatever task they'd done last. If your shirt stood up on its own from grime buildup, it meant you were being practical. If it stood up because it had 37 layers of lace and silver thread, it meant you were nobility, or at least someone bold enough to pretend. Even shoes weren't safe. Pointy-toed shoes were all the rage among the wealthy, because obviously your foot should look like a deadly weapon. They were narrow, uncomfortable, and utterly impractical. But if your toes weren't curling forward like a goat horn, were you even trying? Let's also not forget the time commitment. Dressing like a Tudor noble wasn't a 5-minute process. It was a team sport. You needed attendants, layers, pins, and the spiritual patience of a monk just to get into your clothes without stabbing yourself on your own brooch. Entire mornings were spent getting dressed. That meant you didn't just wear your wealth, you wasted time with it, and the more time you could afford to waste, the higher your status. In the end, Tudor fashion wasn't about comfort or even personal expression, it was about sending a message. I am rich, important, and slowly dying from the arsenic in my underpants. Because in this era, looking good wasn't enough. You had to look like you suffered for it, and preferably, suffer in fabrics that only 1% of the population could legally own. If it didn't choke you, blister you, or poison your armpits, it wasn't high fashion. In the glorious mud-streaked world of Tudor England, falling ill was less about recovering and more about preparing to meet your maker, usually via an encounter with something slimy, smoking, or sharpened. You see, while the Renaissance was lighting up Europe with art and science, Tudor medicine was still stumbling around in a dark alley with a rusty lancet and a bottle of sheep's urine. If you sneezed, someone might bless you or start boiling a badger, and if you were unlucky enough to need a doctor, congratulations, you were about to learn that the cure was often worse than the disease. Let's start with the basics. Catching a cold, no problem. Your local physician might prescribe gargling with vinegar, rubbing a dead pigeon on your chest, or if things got really serious, bleeding you out through a nick in your ankle. But don't worry, it was all very scientific. The go-to theory of the day was the ancient Greek humor theory, which wasn't nearly as funny as it sounds. According to this system, your body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Feeling tired? Too much phlegm. Feeling angry? Too much yellow bile. Feeling skeptical about this theory? That's probably your black bile acting up. To restore balance, doctors used all sorts of creative, red, horrifying techniques. Bloodletting was the Tudor version of turning it off and back on again. Physicians would open a vein or use leeches to suck the bad blood right out of you. These wriggling little vampires were highly prized and had job security most modern interns would envy. They were stored in fancy containers, sometimes fed on milk-soaked bread, and used so frequently that they were basically family pets. And then there were the remedies. Take the common headache, for instance. You might be told to sniff crushed beetles. apply a paste made of chamomile and cow dung, or stick a boiled fox's lung under your pillow. Feeling feverish? Roast some dried toads and grind them into powder. Got the plague? Well, that's unfortunate. But perhaps a poultice made of onions, butter, and a dash of unicorn horn. Spoiler, it was just narwhal tusk, could help. Or you could simply inhale the scent of crushed emeralds and hope for the best. But let's not forget the real heroes of Tudor medicine, the barber surgeons. These were the jack-of-all-trades gentlemen who cut hair, pulled teeth, performed minor surgeries, and probably delivered a baby or two in their spare time. You could walk into one of their shops for a trim and walk out with one less leg. Their symbol, a red and white striped pole representing blood and bandages. It's still used by barbers today, although modern barbers rarely reach for a saw mid-shave. Surgery, in particular, was a thrilling roller coaster of pain and prayers. Anesthesia wasn't invented yet, so if you needed an amputation, you were handed a leather strap to bite on and told to be brave. Speed was everything. A good surgeon could remove a limb in under 2 minutes, which was impressive unless you were the one being turned into a human jigsaw puzzle. Infection? Practically guaranteed, but hey, if you survived the procedure and didn't die of sepsis, you'd earn serious bragging rights. Not many people could say they went for a haircut and left a leg lighter. And let's talk about hygiene, or the remarkable absence of it. Physicians believed bad smells carried disease, so people often doused themselves in perfumes instead of bathing. Public baths had largely gone out of fashion thanks to the Reformation and the suspicion that they were basically sin jacuzzis. That meant many Tudor folks wandered about reeking of sweat, garlic, and hopeless optimism. Cleanliness was next to godlessness, apparently. Medicine chests in wealthier homes were stuffed with oddities. Dried snakes, powdered mummies, yes, actual mummies, bezoar stones, gallstones from animals, and jars of honey preserved with herbs and animal fats. Apothecaries sold everything from mercury to mouldy bread, and if you were lucky they might throw in a pinch of sincerity. Women also played a big role in home medicine. Wise women and midwives often knew far more about healing than official doctors did, though they were sometimes accused of witchcraft when their potions worked too well. Herbs like lavender, rosemary, and wormwood were common remedies, though even these could be taken to extremes. For example, too much wormwood might cure your stomachache, but give you hallucinations that included dancing goats and talking clouds. Ultimately, Tudor medicine was a mix of hope, habit, and horrifying guesswork. People genuinely wanted to help the sick, but they had few tools and even less understanding of germs, bacteria, or the concept of maybe don't put that frog on your face. But give them credit. They kept trying, and in between the leeches, poultices, and pigeon-based inhalers, there was an unshakable belief that somewhere, somehow, the right combination of boiled animal and pungent root could fix everything. The good news? You survived your toothache. The bad news? You're now missing an ear and mildly addicted to opium. Still, it's better than being treated with fox lungs again. Long before modern PR firms, paparazzi and celebrity Instagram filters, there was Elizabeth I, a woman who ruled not only England, but the entire art of self-branding. In a time when women were expected to be quiet, obedient, and firmly in the background, Elizabeth marched into the royal spotlight with a fanfare of symbolism, rhetoric, and extremely high-maintenance skincare. Her reign wasn't just about running a kingdom, it was about curating an image so polished, so controlled, and so unapproachably regal that even her flaws became part of the mythos. And what a mythos it was. Elizabeth fashioned herself as the Virgin Queen, a woman married to her country, too pure for mortal man. This wasn't just a cute tagline, it was a tactful weapon, one that gave her the power to flirt with foreign alliances without ever having to put a ring on it. European monarchs lined up like contestants on a 16th century version of The Bachelor. But Elizabeth never accepted the final rose. Instead, she turned courtship into diplomacy, balancing fragile peace treaties and ambitious suitors like spinning plates, except each plate represented the potential for war. The branding went deeper than her love life. Every public appearance, every speech, every commissioned portrait, served a greater purpose, to present Elizabeth as a radiant, almost divine figure, unaging, wise, and invulnerable. Her portraits didn't just capture her likeness, they captured a message. One such image, the famous Armada portrait, shows Elizabeth standing tall with her hand on a globe, as if she's personally responsible for the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Spoiler, she wasn't on the ships. Behind her, the stormy seas break Spanish ships apart like toys, while Elizabeth looks out at the viewer with an expression that says, "Yes, I did just sink a fleet using only my willpower and cheekbones." Of course, maintaining such a celestial image required help, mainly from the Renaissance equivalent of Photoshop, white lead makeup, to conceal the ravages of smallpox scars and aging. Elizabeth slathered her face in a thick, chalky paste made of white lead and vinegar, known as Venetian ceruse. It gave her that porcelain glow, yes, but it also slowly poisoned her skin, her bloodstream, and possibly even her mind. Imagine suffering from peeling skin, tooth loss, and neurological symptoms, but insisting it's all part of your flawless routine. She basically set the precedent for modern beauty influencers doing 25-step routines for a single selfie, but with a higher risk of death. Her flaming red wigs, often towering, curly, and dotted with jewels, also weren't just fashion statements. They were symbols of power, continuity, and control. Losing hair due to lead poisoning? Just add a bigger wig. People whispering that the Queen was aging? Just commission a portrait that shows her looking like a celestial being with skin smoother than a Renaissance marble statue. Her image was so carefully curated that she banned unflattering portraits altogether. If you were a painter and made her look anything less than divine, you could expect your work to be confiscated or your career to be over faster than you could say, "My bad, Your Majesty." But it wasn't all smoke and mirrors. Elizabeth understood the power of narrative better than any monarch before her. She gave rousing speeches, sometimes in armor, that made her subjects feel like she was fighting right beside them. Her Tilbury speech, delivered as the Spanish Armada approached, included the immortal line, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Goosebumps, right? It's the kind of line that gets taught in history classes and shouted in Oscar-winning biopics centuries later. And it worked. People believed in her, not just as a ruler, but as a near-mythical guardian of the realm. In the end, Elizabeth's image became bigger than Elizabeth the person. She was England's golden icon, a woman who wore poison to look powerful, who wielded marriage proposals like weapons, and who convinced a kingdom that she was eternal. Even as she aged, even as she grew more isolated and wary, the Virgin Queen persona never cracked. She died single, childless, and caked in white paint, but her legend was immortal. The lesson? Before you had publicists, spin doctors, or social media managers, you had to handle the whole PR campaign yourself, with wigs, symbolism, lead-based contouring, and enough confidence to convince an empire you were chosen by God. If you think your weekend plans are wild, imagine telling your kids in Tudor England, "We're off to the Tower of London, don't forget your meat pies." Executions in the Tudor era weren't just legal necessities, they were public spectacles that rivaled market days and morality plays for crowd attendance. You didn't hear someone was executed, you watched with snacks, neighbors, and front-row gossip. It was equal parts horror show and civic theater, and your attendance was a weird sort of patriotic obligation. After all, nothing said "Long live the king" quite like watching someone else not. Execution days were announced like festivals, and the Tower of London was the VIP venue. It wasn't just a prison, it was Tudor Broadway for the final act of some very famous lives. Anne Boleyn, Lady Jane Grey, Thomas More, all took their final bows there, while spectators clutched their handkerchiefs, both for tears and for catching the occasional splatter. And yes, sometimes people brought children, because what better way to instill obedience than showing little Timmy what happens to people who upset the monarch? There was a twisted kind of etiquette to it all. High-ranking nobles often got the deluxe package, private execution, clean blade, and the chance to deliver a final speech filled with Shakespearean regret. Anne Boleyn, for instance, gave a poised farewell, praising Henry VIII even as he had her lined up for decapitation. She wore grey damask and a hood not for modesty, but to keep things tidy for the axe. Her final moments were so composed it made the crowd go silent, a rare thing when you're gathered around a chopping block. The executioners themselves were a strange breed of celebrity. Some were imported from abroad for big-name jobs. Anne's French swordsman, for example, was flown in like a Renaissance-era hitman. But local axemen were less precise. There are stories of multiple swings, botched jobs, and general slicing confusion. Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, famously ran around the scaffold after her executioner missed the first blow. It turned into an undignified and horrifying game of bloody tag. But if you were a commoner, you didn't get the stage. You got Tyburn, and Tyburn was where the real party was. Gallows stood at the crossroads and could handle multiple hangings at once. Imagine a grim version of a pop concert, but with fewer encores and more screaming. Criminals were paraded through the streets in carts, jeered at or pitied by the crowd, depending on the crime and your mood. The lucky ones got a sip of ale before the noose. The unlucky ones got the short drop, which meant they strangled slowly in front of everyone. Oh, and pickpockets worked the crowd because irony was alive and well. Sometimes the crowd wasn't just there for blood, they were there to be moved. If an accused person gave a particularly tear-jerking final speech or showed impressive courage, they could become overnight martyrs or folk heroes. The emotional high of watching someone die with grace was considered cathartic, inspiring. Only in Tudor England could someone be beheaded and still trend socially. Heads, of course, didn't retire quietly. They were often displayed on spikes along London Bridge or the city gates, a grisly version of Yelp reviews. This is what happens when you question the king's divorce. They'd be dipped in tar to delay decay, because if you're going to make a point, you want it to last. Children would dare each other to get close. Lovers might avert their gaze, and the city moved on until the next big execution. Even the act of dying had rules. If you were lucky, you went quickly. If you were really lucky, you got posthumous respect. If not, you might be drawn and quartered, literally cut into pieces, your entrails burned, and body parts sent around the country as anti-rebellion decor. It wasn't just punishment, it was state-sponsored trauma therapy for the masses. In the end, Tudor executions were a strange blend of spectacle and savagery. People cried, people laughed, vendors sold hot pies. The monarch's message was clear. Power meant deciding who lived, who died, and who got the good executioner. And for the average citizen, it was just another reminder to keep your head down and hopefully attached. Welcome to the Tudor banquet, where the cholesterol count was sky high, forks were suspicious foreign contraptions, and you were either gnawing on a sugar swan or praying your gruel didn't contain pebbles. If there's one thing you could say about the Tudor approach to food, it's this: subtlety was not on the menu. Eating wasn't just a necessity. It was theatre, a status symbol, and occasionally a test of gastrointestinal endurance. If you were part of the Tudor upper crust, congratulations, your meals were likely grand, grotesquely abundant, and if we're honest, probably a little terrifying. Meat was the crown jewel of any nobleman's diet. We're not talking your basic chicken nuggets here. No, Tudor nobles dined on venison, boar, mutton, rabbit, goose, and if they were really showing off, swan and peacock. Yes, peacock. The bird wasn't just cooked, it was cooked, cooled, and then redressed in its own feathers for that extra Game of Thrones meets edible taxidermy flair. Nothing says refined palate like slicing into something that's still looking at you with a judgmental beady eye. And the meat parade didn't end there. Breakfast might include beef ribs, while dinner featured whole roast pigs stuffed with birds stuffed with other birds. Vegetables, birds. Vegetables, a suspicious food group best left to peasants and rabbits. The nobility avoided them for fear they'd make you earthy. Quite literally, you'd think dessert might offer some relief, but no, enter the sugar sculptures. These weren't just little cakes, we're talking elaborate edible castles, knights on horseback, and scenes from mythology, all made of sugar paste. They were designed to impress, not necessarily to eat. which makes sense considering sugar was so expensive it was basically a culinary currency. Tudor dentists didn't exactly exist, so it should come as no surprise that these sugary delights left the nobility with blackened, rotting teeth. Ironically, this became a status symbol. If your smile looked like burnt toast, it meant you could afford to ruin it with sugar. While the elite were inhaling goose-laced meat towers, the average Tudor peasant was navigating a very different menu. The diet for the working class revolved around bread, sometimes made with questionable flour, pottage, a stew that could include literally anything: beans, oats, old turnips, maybe a beetle, and if they were lucky, a bit of cheese or ale. Protein was scarce, and meat was a luxury often only consumed on holidays or after a very fortunate accident involving the lord's escaped chicken. Fruits and vegetables were more common, but not by choice, they were just there. Basically, the poorer you were, the more likely your meal resembled damp porridge flavored with resignation. Perhaps one of the most bewildering facts to modern diners is the sheer forklessness of the Tudor era. Eating was done with knives, spoons, and most commonly your fingers. Forks were considered suspiciously foreign, unmanly, or downright devilish. Even Queen Elizabeth I had a few, but only used them when feeling particularly theatrical. Etiquette still mattered, though. Noble guests were expected to bring their own knives, not lick their fingers too much, and never blow their noses into the tablecloth, because, believe it or not, people needed to be reminded of that. Food in Tudor England wasn't just about class, it was also governed by religion and law. The church mandated fish days, particularly Fridays and Lent, when meat was off the table. But don't worry, the nobility had a workaround. Beaver tails were considered fish. Don't ask, just nod. Sumptuary laws also dictated what you could eat and serve based on your social standing. A merchant couldn't throw a dinner party with roasted swan unless he wanted to risk a fine or worse, jail time for culinary impersonation. Put all of this together: endless meat, sugar, salt, wine, and zero understanding of nutrition. And it's no wonder gout was basically the aristocrat's handshake. The Tudor diet was rich, heavy, and as dangerous as anything coming out of a modern-day fast food drive-through. Even Henry VIII, king of indulgence, ballooned in size toward the end of his life. His daily meals were so extravagant that entire kitchens and teams of servants were dedicated solely to the preparation of his dishes. By the time of his death, his leg ulcers had their own reputation. Dining in Tudor England was less about nourishment and more about making a statement. For the rich, it was pageantry. For the poor, it was survival. Whether you were feasting on a peacock's face or scraping porridge from a cracked bowl, one thing was clear: nobody left the table unchanged. Because in Tudor times, food wasn't just fuel, it was tactics, class, identity, and occasionally, your final mistake. And remember, if you made it through a Tudor breakfast without heartburn, food poisoning, or dying of lead-based sugar, you were already winning the day. In Tudor England, education was less about sparking intellectual curiosity and more about drilling obedience into your skull, preferably through the repeated application of Latin grammar and a large wooden stick. If you were a child in this era, odds are you weren't asking what you were going to be when you grew up. You were too busy conjugating verbs, avoiding bruises, and wondering if your spine was still straight after the schoolmaster's latest motivational session with the birch rod. For boys, education was a strict, often brutal affair. Grammar schools were the default destination for any lad whose parents could afford to keep him from the fields. The name grammar school wasn't just a cute label, it meant Latin grammar all day, every day. Forget learning how to make change or write a polite letter. You were expected to memorize great chunks of Latin poetry, recite them under pressure, and then copy them out in your best handwriting until your fingers cramped up like a dying spider. And if you asked, why Latin? The answer was simple. Latin was the language of the church, the law, the government, and most importantly, the language of the smart-looking people who weren't breaking rocks for a living. But Tudor schooling didn't stop at dull lectures. No, it came with the added excitement of corporal punishment. Mispronounce your lines? Get hit. Forget your inkpot? Get hit. Breathe too loud? You guessed it, hit again. Teachers weren't just educators, they were part-time enforcers of discipline, wielding canes, birches, and the fear of God like pros. The birch rod became so iconic in these classrooms that it could have had its own school uniform. In some schools there was even a student whose job was to hold the rod until the teacher needed it, possibly the most nerve-wracking internship in history. Girls, meanwhile, were often excluded entirely from formal schooling, unless you were nobility, and even then, only sometimes. Education for girls was home-based and focused on skills deemed appropriate. That meant needlework, religious instruction, and learning to run a household without accidentally burning it down. While their brothers were being verbally thrashed in Latin, many girls were memorizing psalms and learning to curtsy without fainting. Reading was sometimes allowed, writing less so, and anything beyond arithmetic was considered borderline scandalous. Algebra, that was witchcraft. Geometry, devil's circles. Among the elite, things were a bit more refined, only a bit. A young noble boy might be assigned a tutor and taught the humanist curriculum, which included Latin, Greek, philosophy, and rhetoric. But even then, the fun was theoretical. Education was not about creativity, it was about discipline, piety, and ensuring your brain was packed full of enough Cicero quotes to survive court. And while elite girls sometimes got access to tutors, the education was still tailored to ensure they remained accomplished without threatening to become too intellectual. Heaven forbid a lady quotes Seneca at dinner. Even playtime had rules. Recreational activities, when allowed, were limited and often structured in a way that somehow involved more rules, more obedience, and surprise, more moral lessons. This was not the era of whimsical recess. No one was swinging from a rope pretending to be a pirate. You were more likely to be punished for daydreaming about a squirrel than encouraged to explore your imagination. And let's not forget the religious component. Tudor education was marinated in religious doctrine, with the country ping-ponging between Catholicism and Protestantism depending on who was sitting on the throne. Students were expected to memorize the correct version of theology at any given moment. If Henry VIII said God approved of his divorce, then by all means write that down. If Mary I said the Pope was your spiritual daddy again, better memorize that. Flip-flopping wasn't just for tactful acts. It was a survival skill. There was also a class divide in education that couldn't be ignored. The poor, especially in rural areas, were lucky to be literate. Many children never saw the inside of a schoolroom, spending their days working instead. For them, education was a luxury, not a right. A plough didn't care if you knew Latin declensions, and the landlord didn't give discounts for good handwriting. Some children might learn a bit of reading from a parish priest or parent, but this was patchy at best. By the time a child emerged from Tudor schooling, if they made it that far without flunking out, being beaten senseless, or conscripted into an apprenticeship, they weren't necessarily more intelligent. But they could certainly sit up straight, write Latin in excruciatingly neat cursive, and recite proverbs about obedience while bleeding slightly from the knuckles. Tudor education was not a cheerful, encouraging place. It was a factory of discipline, dogma, and drilled recitation, a place where knowledge meant memorization, creativity was a liability, and emotional resilience was forged under the constant threat of wooden rods. School didn't prepare you for life. It dared you to survive it. If you ever find yourself daydreaming about time traveling to the glittering courts of Tudor England, allow us to bring you back to reality, preferably with a lice comb and a clothespin for your nose, because for all the pageantry and poetry, the average day for a common Tudor citizen was a chaotic blend of poor hygiene, lingering odors, itchy undergarments, and existential dread. Simply put, if you were breathing, sweating, and not currently dying of plague, you were doing better than most. Let's begin with personal hygiene, or, more accurately, the total absence of it. Bathing by Tudor standards was considered suspiciously luxurious and possibly sinful. People believed that water opened the pores and allowed disease to seep in, like an open invitation for the plague to waltz into your bloodstream. As a result, full baths were avoided, especially by the lower classes. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, which sounds like a solid joke until you realize she was still cleaner than most. Instead of actual washing, many Tudors relied on linen underclothes to soak up the filth, then simply changed the linens once they were stiff enough to stand on their own. Perfumes and scented handkerchiefs were used to battle body odor, but considering that everyone smelled equally terrible, the olfactory playing field was level. Toilets were more of a suggestion than a certainty. Chamber pots were the go-to for nighttime emergencies or indoor convenience, and disposing of their contents usually meant flinging them into the street with a hearty "Gardyloo," a shout that roughly translated to "Look out below, human waste incoming." Streets often ran with more than just rainwater, and shoes were considered a semi-sacred barrier between you and a puddle of yesterday's dinner and today's digestive regret. Lease were as much a part of Tudor life as bread and ale. Nitpicking was a social bonding activity, and if you didn't scratch your scalp at least twice a minute, people might wonder what was wrong with you. Fleas were ubiquitous, burrowing into the straw bedding and occasionally your dignity. Pets and livestock like pigs, chickens, and the occasional goat often shared your living space, particularly if you were poor, which made your home smell like a barn because technically it was one. And let's not forget about disease. Tudor England lived in constant fear of outbreaks. The plague, sweating sickness, and smallpox made frequent uninvited appearances. If your neighbor started developing buboes or mysterious rashes, you didn't send soup, you nailed their door shut and hoped for the best. Whole families could vanish in a matter of days, and quarantine meant locking the sick in and throwing bread through the window if you were generous, while waiting to see if anyone came out alive. In between outbreaks, you still had plenty of things to worry about, like religion. The Tudors were famously devout when they weren't swinging between Protestantism and Catholicism depending on who sat on the throne. Your daily schedule revolved around prayer, church attendance, and trying not to get caught in the wrong belief system at the wrong time. Under Henry VIII, Catholicism was dangerous. Under Mary I, Protestantism could get you barbecued. Under Elizabeth I, you'd better toe the Anglican line or start getting really good at apologizing. Superstition also crept into daily life like mold under a leaky thatched roof. People believed in witches, curses, and the devil hiding behind every unfortunate sneeze. If your cow died or your bread failed to rise, someone nearby was probably hexing you. This led to an unfortunate trend of accusing widows and midwives of witchcraft and solving the matter with a good old-fashioned ducking stool or a bonfire. As for fun, if you had time between plague scares and chamber pot duty, you might enjoy bear baiting, public executions, or watching a drunken neighbor fall off a roof. Ale was consumed like water, often because water itself could kill you, and communal dancing or storytelling offered brief reprieve from the general misery of surviving another day. But even with all that gloom, the Tudors endured. They married, raised children, celebrated festivals, and held on to hope in a world where mortality lurked behind every sniffle and every suspicious-looking rat. Life was uncomfortable, unpredictable, and occasionally unexplainable, but it was life, and in Tudor England that was no small victory. If you've ever quit a job because of an annoying coworker, then congratulations, you already understand 17th century religious schisms. The Pilgrims weren't just escaping persecution. They were running from a country that looked at their strict religious ways and went, "Even we think that's a bit much." Let's set the holy scene. England in the early 1600s was still recovering from its spiritual identity crisis. First, Henry VIII broke up with the Pope because Rome wouldn't let him divorce his wife. Then Queen Elizabeth I tried to make Protestantism cool again, but not too Protestant, more like a spiritual compromise with fancy robes. Enter the Puritans, England's overachieving religious zealots who looked at the Church of England and said, "This place still smells too Catholic." They wanted to purify the church of what they saw as lingering popish nonsense, incense, stained glass, and clergymen who smiled. The Puritans were like that one guy in your friend group who insists Taco Bell isn't real Mexican food, technically right but exhausting. But even within the Puritan group, there was a hardcore sub-faction that thought reforming the church wasn't enough. They didn't want to purify it. They wanted to leave it entirely. These were the separatists. And if the Church of England was Taco Bell, they were spiritually going raw vegan. The separatists believed that the official English church was hopelessly corrupt and that true Christians should form their own small, independent congregations. This sounds innocent enough, but in 1600s England, deciding to form your own church was a bit like declaring yourself king of your living room. It was treason adjacent. Refusing to attend Anglican services wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. So when these earnest holy folk decided to go rogue, the government went full medieval. Separatist leaders were arrested, fined, or publicly shamed. One leader, William Brewster, was printing underground religious texts like a 17th century zine publisher. Another, William Bradford, was just a teenager when he joined the rebellion. Proof that even back then, nothing said cool youth counterculture like abandoning the national church. And so, in true teenage fashion, the separatists looked around at their oppressive homeland and said, "You just don't understand me, England. I'm leaving." But where does a group of radical Protestants go when their home country says, "No worshipping your way"? They find somewhere weirdly tolerant. In 1608, the separatists packed up their families and fled to Leiden, a city in the Dutch Republic known for its religious tolerance. Yes, tolerance. In the early 1600s. Shocking, I know. The Dutch were like, sure, believe whatever you want, just don't mess with the cheese exports. Leiden was peaceful and accepting, which of course immediately made the Pilgrims suspicious. At first they were grateful for the freedom to worship without harassment, but after a while, problems popped up faster than you can say Calvinist guilt. First, there was the language barrier. Dutch isn't exactly the most intuitive language, especially if your vocabulary consists mostly of Bible verses and judgment. Then there was the economy. Many of the Pilgrims were skilled craftsmen back in England, but in the bustling Dutch cities, they found themselves reduced to low-paying, back-breaking labor. Suddenly, their dream of building a perfect holy community turned into working in textile mills for 14 hours a day, while their kids picked up the local slang and started listening to Dutch music, whatever that was. But worst of all, their children started acting Dutch. Cue dramatic organ music. The Pilgrims watched in horror as their kids grew up speaking Dutch, enjoying holidays, dancing, yes, dancing, and absorbing local values that weren't all fire, brimstone, and no smiling. To the Pilgrims, this was cultural death. It was bad enough that the world was full of sinners. They didn't want their children becoming cheerful ones. So after about a decade of stewing in foreign music, hard labor, and moral panic, they decided they needed a fresh start. Somewhere they could be free, devout, and completely isolated from influences like tolerance. They looked west, far west, past the ocean, to a wild, dangerous, uncolonized land where they could raise their children properly, build their holy society, and not have to say "dank you well" ever again. Their plan? Charter a ship, cross an ocean, and build a new society from scratch in the New World. Easy, they convinced some London investors to fund the journey, because nothing says great business plan like giving money to religious radicals with no farming experience, and prepared to set sail aboard a ship called the Mayflower, a vessel that was somehow less seaworthy than their theological opinions. And so, in 1620, after leaving England, fleeing to Holland, and spending a decade frowning at tulips, the Pilgrims set out for the New World to create a religious utopia, because when you're too intense for 17th century England and the Netherlands, there's really only one place left to go. Let's make one thing clear. The Mayflower was not a cruise ship. It wasn't even a particularly good cargo ship. It was a 100-foot floating wooden panic room, designed for hauling wine, not for shoving over 100 humans into close proximity for 2 months of wet socks and gastrointestinal distress. The Pilgrims might have been dreaming of religious freedom, but by day 3 at sea, most of them were dreaming of dry land, functioning knees, and toilets that weren't just a bucket in a corner. When the Mayflower finally set sail in September 1620, it carried approximately 102 passengers, around 30 crew members, and 0 personal space. The passenger list was a mix of religious separatists and other settlers referred to as strangers, aka people who were not there for God but for potential profit. Nothing like shoving pious zealots and gold-hungry adventurers into the same dark room and rocking them back and forth for 8 weeks to build lifelong friendships. And while the top deck was where the crew worked and got rained on, the passengers were crammed below deck into the gun deck because what screams safe journey like stuffing the passengers in a cannon bay. This space was about 5 feet high, meaning most adults couldn't stand upright, let alone stretch. Everyone lived, ate, slept and sneezed into the same air. Imagine living in your garage. Now imagine it rocks violently, leaks constantly, and also 131 other people live in it. Welcome aboard. The Mayflower leaked. A lot. Even before it left England, one of its companion ships, the Speedwell, sprung so many leaks that it had to turn back twice before being abandoned altogether. The Mayflower bravely soldiered on across the North Atlantic in storm season, because why not add angry ocean to the list of challenges? Waves smashed against the hull. Rain poured in through gaps. Mold took up residence in every crevice. Clothes, bedding, food, everything was constantly damp, including hope. To combat the stench and sanitation issues, passengers had a great solution. They didn't. They just added to it. Bathing wasn't a thing. There were no showers, no sinks, and no fresh laundry. The ship's toilet was essentially a wooden seat over a bucket, shared, of course, because privacy is a luxury reserved for people not hurling into a communal bucket in a storm. Also, remember those food supplies the Pilgrims brought for survival in the New World? Yeah, some of that had to be eaten during the journey just to avoid starvation. Hardtack, salted meat, dried peas, basically the culinary equivalent of punishment. Combine that with seawater sloshing into your food, and the fact that cooking fires were understandably discouraged on a wooden ship, and you've got a menu Gordon Ramsay would scream at in Latin. Let's talk seasickness. Most passengers had never been on a ship before, so when the Mayflower hit rough seas, which was basically every day, passengers began to turn green faster than their salted cabbage rations. People vomited, fainted and prayed, sometimes all at once. The smell of the ship was described by some as nauseating. Others simply stopped describing things altogether because it required lifting their heads. The rolling motion didn't just make people sick, it also made things dangerous. One poor passenger, John Howland, decided to go topside during a storm, got knocked overboard, and was briefly introduced to the cold Atlantic. Miraculously, he grabbed a rope and was hauled back on deck, freezing and probably rethinking all of his life choices. Imagine falling into an icy ocean and then realizing your best option is still going back onto the Mayflower. The crew wasn't much better. Sailors referred to the passengers as psalm-singing landlubbers, and took great joy in mocking their suffering until one particularly mouthy sailor dropped dead of disease. The Pilgrims, naturally, viewed this as divine karma. Everyone else just tried not to die next, because clearly the experience wasn't chaotic enough. A child was born during the voyage. His name? Oceanus Hopkins. Yes, Oceanus. Because if you're going to enter the world in a floating dungeon full of lice and fear, you might as well have a name that says this trauma started early. His poor mother gave birth in conditions best described as don't. No doctors, no clean linens, no silence. Just the creaking of timber, the retching of neighbors, and someone definitely praying too loudly nearby. The one group who thrived, rats. The Mayflower was their idea of a 5-star buffet. Crumbs, filth, and terrified humans made for excellent company. While the passengers were rationing their last moldy biscuit, the rats were living their best lives. After 66 days at sea, the Mayflower finally sighted land in November. The passengers staggered off the boat, some crawling, some sobbing, all smelling like something that should have been left behind in England. They had made it. Technically, the worst part was over. November 1620. The sea was behind them, the wind was cruel, and their shoes were still soggy. After 66 days of sailing, vomiting and praying through storms, the Pilgrims finally caught sight of land. Cheers were probably weak and tearful, not because of overwhelming joy, but because even seasick religious separatists could recognize irony. They were not where they were supposed to be. The original plan, if you can call a vague dream funded by businessmen a plan, was to settle near the mouth of the Hudson River in the region of the Virginia colony. You know, farther south, where winter wasn't trying to murder you with icicles to the face. But thanks to rough seas, unreliable navigation and what might generously be called poor decision-making, the Mayflower veered off course. Instead of the fertile, already somewhat established areas they hoped for, they landed in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, a place that in November could best be described as hostile terrain with decorative frostbite. This was not a soft landing. There was no welcoming committee, no cabins, no food stands, and certainly no tourist brochures, just uncharted wilderness, bone-chilling winds, and a bunch of exhausted passengers in layered wool garments regretting most of their life choices. And here's where things get spicy. Because they were outside the official bounds of the Virginia colony's patent, they had no legal right to be there. In other words, their permission slip from King James was now useless. The legal structure they were supposed to operate under didn't apply in Massachusetts. Some of the less spiritually enthusiastic passengers, the strangers, started murmuring about just doing their own thing, which in 1600s colonial code translates roughly to, "Let's start ignoring authority now and see what happens." That's when the Pilgrims did what all desperate, vaguely democratic people do in a crisis. They held a meeting. Enter the Mayflower Compact, history's most desperate attempt to keep things from unraveling on day one. Imagine over 100 cold, hungry, anxious people standing on a creaking ship at anchor, and someone goes, "Before we set foot on land, let's invent a government so Dave from the lower bunk doesn't start his own pirate kingdom." That's essentially what happened. The compact was not a thrilling read. It was short, vaguely worded, and written like a group project where everyone just wanted to go home. But it was a radical little document. It stated that the settlers would create a civil body politic for the good of the colony, and would agree to follow the laws and leadership that the majority chose. In other words, let's all promise not to go completely Lord of the Flies. This wasn't the US Constitution or anything remotely polished, but considering these people hadn't bathed in over 2 months and were writing it on a freezing boat surrounded by suspicious muttering, it was an impressive little moment of unity. It's often called the first seed of American democracy. It's also the first example of people in the New World holding a formal meeting that basically said, "Let's not do crimes yet." With that settled, and everyone signed on, including several people who probably didn't fully understand what they were agreeing to, the settlers finally went ashore to explore. Explore in this context means wander around the woods wondering what they've done. The landscape was alien, towering forests, frozen earth, and suspiciously quiet. No inns, no settlements, no sign of a welcome mat. It wasn't even the first time Europeans had landed there. John Smith had mapped the area years before, but the Pilgrims didn't exactly arrive with that map laminated and ready to go. They initially landed at Provincetown, but soon realized it was all sand and sadness. So they spent several weeks rowing around the bay, poking the shoreline with sticks, and trying to find somewhere remotely inhabitable. Meanwhile, supplies continued to dwindle, and the temperature kept reminding them that Mother Nature was not in a welcoming mood. On December 16, 1620, yes, mid-December, they finally settled on Plymouth, a spot with a nearby river, decent harbour, and some cleared fields. The irony? The land had once been home to a thriving Native American village that had been devastated by an epidemic a few years earlier. The fields they would later claim as providentially ready were, in fact, the result of tragedy. But in the Pilgrims' eyes it was a divine sign. "God has cleared the land for us," they said, tactfully ignoring that it had been cleared by smallpox and sorrow. So there they were, cold, underfed, out of place, and about to build a town from scratch in winter. But hey, at least they had the Mayflower Compact, which might not build houses or grow food, but could certainly help stop the colony from devolving into a chaos-driven knife fight over the last crumb of hardtack. They had no blueprint, no survival manual, just a vague promise to behave, a ship full of coughs, and land that was colder than their interpersonal relationships. Plymouth was born. not with celebration but with shivering silence and the faint sound of someone wondering if it was too late to go back to Holland. There are bad winters and then there's first Pilgrim winter bad. It was the kind of season that made you look longingly at the Grim Reaper and think, you know what, at least he's punctual. The Pilgrims landed in December 1620, just in time to enjoy the full force of a New England winter, without any of the survival basics like shelter, food, or a single clue what they were doing. Let's be clear, these were not rugged outdoorsy types. They didn't show up in fur coats with axes over their shoulders and dreams of frontier living. No, they showed up in ill-fitting wool, religious conviction, and shoes that soaked through on contact with a damp sneeze. They were city folk and religious scholars, not survivalists. Their greatest wilderness skill was arguing about theology, and as a fun bonus, they didn't build anything before the snow came. Not a single house was ready, which is a bit like hosting a dinner party without a kitchen or food. The Mayflower remained anchored off the coast, and the passengers used it as a floating motel while they scouted and occasionally poked the frozen earth in despair. But the ship wasn't exactly cozy. It was still wet, still cold, and by now, thanks to a delightful combination of poor nutrition and poor ventilation, a breeding ground for disease. They weren't just uncomfortable, they were dying. The first winter claimed about half of the Pilgrims. That's right, by the time spring rolled around, over 50 of the original 102 passengers were dead. And no, they didn't go out peacefully watching the snow fall from a cozy cabin window. They went out on the ship, or huddled on shore in makeshift shelters, often from illness, malnutrition or exposure. Diseases like scurvy, pneumonia and tuberculosis ran wild. Remember, these were people already weakened by the transatlantic voyage, fed on salted meat and stale biscuits, and now trying to survive in sub-zero temperatures with no sanitation. This was less valiant colonial struggle and more slow-motion disaster in period costume. By February, the situation was so bad that only 6 or 7 people were healthy enough to care for the rest. Imagine being one of those poor souls trying to drag your feverish neighbors to buckets, nurse them with broth made from sadness, and mop up whatever bodily fluids were happening, all while coughing yourself. It wasn't a community anymore. It was a cold, damp triage unit with bonus hymn singing. Food, predictably, became a crisis. Whatever supplies they had brought were dwindling, and nothing grows in a Massachusetts January except regret. They weren't farming yet. Hunting was tough, and fishing requires equipment and a basic will to live, which was in short supply. So they scraped by on scraps, salted pork, dried peas, and perhaps, if they were lucky, a spoonful of something that hadn't been walked across by rats. And let's not forget clothing. It wasn't like they had winter coats rated for Arctic weather. They had wool layers, maybe a cloak, and a dream. Their shoes leaked. Their hats were more about fashionably rebuking joy than warmth. And mittens? Please. If you weren't frostbitten, you were underdressed. Probably both. Then there was the psychological toll. Imagine you've spent years dreaming of a new land where you can build a godly society, only to wake up every morning praying that someone else doesn't die before breakfast. Morale wasn't just low, it had fallen through the floorboards and was curled up next to a half-frozen biscuit, wondering how long it had left. These were people who believed they were on a divinely guided mission, and now they were watching their friends, their spouses, even their children perish in the dark. And yet, incredibly, they didn't all give up. The Mayflower's captain offered to sail the survivors back to England when spring arrived, a completely reasonable suggestion, considering half of them were dead and the other half were trying not to cough their lungs out. But the Pilgrims refused. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was faith, maybe it was the haunting realization that if they went back, they'd have to explain what happened and admit they still hadn't built anything. So they stayed. They buried their dead in secret, often at night, so that nearby native tribes wouldn't realize how weak and outnumbered they were. They pressed forward into spring with the enthusiasm of people who had run out of other options. The irony, of course, is sharp. They left Europe to escape persecution and build a new life, and were immediately punished by nature with the emotional equivalent of being repeatedly hit in the face with a frozen sock. The New World, it turned out, didn't care about their intentions. It cared about their lack of houses. They had crossed the Atlantic for religious freedom. Instead, they got frostbite, funerals, and a first-hand education in why winter is not the time to start from scratch in an unfamiliar wilderness. It wasn't a heroic beginning. It was an icy slap across the theological face. And the worst part? The work hadn't even started yet. Arriving in the New World was supposed to be the start of something noble, a fresh beginning, a land of opportunity, a place where they could finally live in peace and godliness. And then, like every ambitious home renovation show gone horribly wrong, the Pilgrims realized they had brought exactly none of the people or tools necessary to actually build that new life. Let's start with the most glaring issue. The Pilgrims were, by and large, not rugged survivalists. This was not a group of skilled farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, or foragers. These were tailors, weavers, shopkeepers, and ministers. The kind of people who could debate theology for hours but would absolutely lose a fistfight with a potato. They knew how to read scripture, but not how to recognize poisonous berries. If you gave them a nail and some wood, they'd be more likely to hold a prayer circle than build a house. They brought a vision of heaven on earth but forgot the blueprints and the toolbox. To make matters worse, their luggage was comically misaligned with their needs. The manifest revealed a strong preference for items like books, clothing, and religious texts, things that are great for your soul but bad for chopping trees. One account mentioned they brought more barrels of beer than they did tools for planting crops. In fairness, if you had just spent 66 days on the Mayflower, you might pack heavily on the beer too, but still, priorities, food, unsurprisingly, became a problem. The little they had brought was either gone, spoiled, or so nutritionally bankrupt it might as well have been communion wafers and wishful thinking. And unlike today's settlers, red people moving into fixer-uppers in Vermont with TikTok channels, they didn't have the benefit of YouTube tutorials or a handy foraging for dummies guide. Their best bet? Rob the neighbors. No, really, the Pilgrims, starving and desperate, did what any morally upright, spiritually devout group would do in a pinch. They looted a Native American corn cache. Yes, not long after landing, they discovered a stash of buried maize left in a carefully preserved underground pit by the local Wampanoag. Did they ask first? No. Did they thank them? Kind of later. Retroactively, once they weren't literally dying of hunger. For now it was finders keepers, and the equivalent of breaking into someone's pantry while they're not home. And building shelters? An absolute disaster. With the New England winter nipping at their religiously clad heels and the land offering zero sympathy, they began to construct homes with very little knowledge and even less equipment. Some of the early shelters were little more than wood-framed huts with thatched roofs, assembled by people who'd never built anything more complex than a stern sermon. You can imagine how structurally sound those turned out. By spring, what buildings they did have were more like polite suggestions of homes than actual protection. The walls leaked, the roofs sagged, and wind whistled through the gaps like a judgmental ghost. Firewood was scarce, and tools dulled quickly from misuse. After all, it's hard to chop trees when you've only ever chopped celery. They tried farming, emphasis on tried, but again the land was unfamiliar. The growing season was different, and half the crops they brought weren't even suited for the climate. It was the equivalent of planting oranges in Alaska. Even if someone had remembered to pack seeds, and some did, it didn't guarantee success. The soil didn't care how pious you were. If you didn't know how to coax crops from the earth, you were out of luck. You'd think someone somewhere might have raised their hand before they left England and asked, "Should we maybe bring like a farmer, just one?" But alas, in the great game of colonial fantasy drafting, the Pilgrims picked heavy on clergy and light on anyone with dirt under their fingernails. It wasn't until the indigenous tribes, particularly the Wampanoag, under the guidance of Tisquantum Squanto, intervened that the colony had a fighting chance. But let's not jump ahead. That miracle of agricultural charity comes later. At this point in the story, the Pilgrims were still fumbling in the dark, often literally, as they lacked enough lanterns and candles. Their survival strategy, if you could call it that, was a mix of prayer, desperation, and hoping that perhaps the Lord would send down a pre-assembled log cabin and a crate of chickens. He did not. To sum it up, they came to the New World to build a society from the ground up, and they brought the spiritual equivalent of IKEA instructions, confusing, incomplete, and missing half the parts. If the Pilgrims were influencers today, their Instagram bio would read, faith-driven, outdoorsy-ish, forgot the shovel. The Pilgrims had a problem, and not just the usual problems like starvation, frostbite, or accidentally constructing a house with the door on the roof. No, this problem was bigger. They were not alone. When the Mayflower dropped anchor and its bedraggled passengers began bumbling around Cape Cod Bay like confused religious mall walkers, they weren't stepping into a new world. They were stepping into someone else's very old one. Enter the Wampanoag, an established and deeply rooted confederation of native peoples who had lived in the region for thousands of years and who were now staring at the Pilgrims with what must have been a mix of curiosity, alarm, and eventually pity. Now, imagine being in the Wampanoag's moccasins. One day you're going about your business, fishing, hunting, farming, existing in a society with political structures and agriculture and spiritual depth, and the next, a bunch of pale, oddly dressed strangers show up in your neighborhood, coughing dramatically and stealing corn from your food storage pits, and not even well. They didn't try to be sneaky. They just stumbled around, shivering, digging, and thanking God when they found something that didn't kill them instantly. At this point, the Wampanoag had every right to chase them back into the sea, and historically speaking, many native tribes might have. But the Wampanoag, led by Chief Massasoit, had their reasons for showing restraint and even generosity. One big reason? Recent trauma. Just a few years earlier, a devastating plague, likely brought by European traders, had ravaged indigenous communities along the coast, wiping out an estimated 2/3 of the Wampanoag population. Entire villages were left empty. This wasn't just a humanitarian tragedy. It also left them vulnerable to rival tribes like the Narragansett, who were eyeing weakened Wampanoag lands like vultures at a barbecue. So when these odd, floundering English settlers showed up, Massasoit saw, well, not an opportunity exactly, but maybe a desperate plan B. These people clearly don't know how to survive, which means they're not a threat, but maybe they could be allies, or, at the very least, loud, shivering scarecrows to keep the Narragansett at bay. That's where Tisquantum, better known to history as Squanto, enters the scene like a character from a completely different movie. Squanto had survived enslavement by the English, lived in Europe, learned English, then returned home to find his entire Patuxet village wiped out by plague. So yes, the man had seen some things, and yet instead of turning his back on these baffling new settlers, he became their translator, guide, agricultural consultant, and part-time babysitter. Squanto's role can't be overstated. He taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn in fish-fertilized mounds, which sounded insane to them but worked wonders. He showed them where to hunt and fish, how to navigate the land, and likely helped them avoid eating too many poisonous berries. Without Squanto, the colony may have devolved into a tragic footnote. New England, briefly tried, quickly abandoned. The Pilgrims, for their part, were stunned. This man speaks English, and knows how to farm, and is helping us willingly? To the religious settlers, Squanto's arrival was divine intervention, though in reality it was just one man's unbelievable series of misfortunes turning into someone else's miracle. Despite the language and cultural gaps, a fragile diplomacy began to form. A formal peace treaty was signed between Massasoit and the Pilgrims, promising mutual protection and non-aggression. And while we now know that future generations of colonists would absolutely torch that treaty with the kindling of greed and expansionism, at this particular moment in 1621, peace held. Still, it's hard not to imagine the internal commentary of the Wampanoag. Watching the Pilgrims try to farm, fish, or exist must have been like watching toddlers try to run a bakery. They were earnest, certainly, but wildly underqualified. It was probably like a season of Survivor, except the contestants didn't realize they were on the show. and the hosts, Massasoit, Squanto and friends, had to keep them from dying just to keep things remotely entertaining. It wasn't all singing kumbaya around the campfire, of course. There were deep misunderstandings, culture clashes, and a building tension beneath the politeness. But in that first year, the Pilgrims were simply too weak and too clueless to pose a threat. They needed the Wampanoag more than the Wampanoag needed them, and both sides knew it. The result? A momentary balance, an uneasy alliance built on necessity, not idealism. The Pilgrims got to survive and eventually hold a feast they'd turn into a national myth, and the Wampanoag got a temporary buffer from their enemies. Everyone ate corn, and thus began one of the strangest, most lopsided partnerships in American history. One side came with muskets and desperation, the other came with thousands of years of lived knowledge and a very patient attitude. The first Thanksgiving, the event that launched 1,000 centerpieces and every elementary school's annual excuse to dress children in paper hats and construction paper feathers. You know the scene, smiling pilgrims in spotless black outfits and enormous belt buckles, shaking hands with friendly Native Americans as they pass around bowls of mashed potatoes and slices of pumpkin pie. Heartwarming, right? Well, not quite. Let's just say the real 1621 gathering was more Hunger Games meets awkward diplomatic summit than Hallmark Channel original. To set the table, pun very much intended, this so-called first Thanksgiving wasn't even called that by the people attending it. The Pilgrims never used the term. The Wampanoag definitely didn't, and the event itself wasn't about gratitude in the warm, fuzzy, overly sentimental way we understand it now. It was about politics, survival, and meat, lots and lots of meat. Let's rewind to the fall of 1621. Against all odds, the Pilgrims were still alive. Granted, about half of them weren't, thanks to disease, starvation, and cold winters, but the remaining settlers had somehow scraped together a harvest. This was largely thanks to the Wampanoag showing them how not to die by eating mushrooms or planting corn upside down. So the Pilgrims, possibly giddy from the novelty of digestible calories, decided to throw a feast. Now, before you imagine an artfully set table in a rustic barn with wildflowers in mason jars, understand that the vibe was more tired colonists eating off wooden plates than Martha Stewart or autumnal elegance. The celebration lasted 3 days. Yes, 3. And while it was indeed a feast, it wasn't an annual tradition. It wasn't a Thanksgiving in the sense we use today. It was more like a harvest festival crossed with a strategic PR move. You see, Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader who had helped establish the fragile peace with the Pilgrims, showed up with 90 men. Imagine you invite a friend over for dinner and they arrive with the extended family, the in-laws, and their entire football team. This was no polite RSVP situation, they just came. And they brought 5 deer because if you're going to crash a colonial potluck, at least bring something edible. So what was on the menu? Forget your cranberry sauce fantasies. There was no sugar for sweet treats. There were no mashed potatoes because they hadn't even heard of potatoes from Idaho. And pumpkin pie? Not unless you enjoy raw pumpkin scooped from a gourd and angrily gnawed between prayers. The actual fare probably included venison, roast fowl, possibly wild turkey, more likely duck or goose, corn, but not on the cob, and maybe some seafood like mussels or eels. You know, the kind of food that says, "We survived a brutal winter, please don't judge our seasoning." Drinks? Hope you like water, possibly weak beer if you were lucky. Definitely nothing that came with bubbles or a twist of lime. And the entertainment? Cultural confusion with a side of what do we do now? There may have been target shooting or athletic contests, though we can't rule out an epic staring contest across the fire pit as each side tried to decode the other's idea of hospitality. For the Wampanoag, this wasn't a "wow, thanks for inviting us to your adorable colonial cookout" moment. It was an opportunity to reinforce political ties. The presence of 90 armed men at your dinner party says, sure, we're friends, but let's not forget who has the numbers. The Wampanoag were testing the waters, helping, yes, but also watching. They knew these settlers weren't just passing through, they were building, staying, expanding. The feast was both a gesture of goodwill and a strategic surveillance mission with drumsticks. For the Pilgrims, the event was partly relief, partly gratitude, and partly political posturing. "Look at us, we're thriving." Narrator voice. They were not thriving. They gave thanks, most likely in long solemn prayers that nearly ruined everyone's appetite. Not because life was easy, but because they hadn't all died yet. And just like that, the so-called first Thanksgiving ended. There were no commemorative t-shirts, no annual repeats, no sales on muskets the following Monday. The idea that this event was the origin of the modern holiday didn't appear until over 200 years later. It wasn't until the 19th century, when America desperately wanted wholesome origin stories, that the myth was baked into the national consciousness like an overcooked turkey. In reality, the 1621 feast was never meant to start a tradition. It was a one-time, messy, improvised, and very human moment of shared necessity, one that, in hindsight, looked a lot more like a temporary ceasefire than a celebration of unity. So the next time you sit down at your Thanksgiving table with all the fixings, turkey, stuffing, green bean casserole shaped like a Midwestern monument to sodium, remember that the original version had no pie, plenty of confusion, and a tense understanding that everything could go sideways at any moment. They gave thanks not because everything was fine, but because somehow they were still here. If you've ever complained that your 9 to 5 is soul-crushing, imagine a life where your day begins before sunrise, ends after sunset, and consists of nothing but praying, farming, building, and more praying, with no coffee, no weekends, and absolutely no holidays. Welcome to Plymouth in the 1620s, where even your frown had better be pious. Life in Plymouth was many things, but relaxing was not one of them. The settlers were Puritans, people who thought the Church of England was too fun and wanted to strip religion down to its least entertaining essentials. If joy was a seasoning, the Puritans were the boiled chicken of humanity. Let's start with the daily grind. The average day began somewhere between rooster's scream and "is this even legal?" before you could think, "maybe I'll hit snooze." You were out the door chopping wood, tending crops, mending fences, or doing your third round of laundry with water that was only slightly warmer than your tears. Women handled most of the domestic chores, cooking over open hearths, spinning wool, caring for children, while men built homes, repaired tools, and wrangled the occasional rebellious pig. Kids didn't get off easy either. Childhood in Plymouth was a working internship for adulthood, with no snack breaks. And forget the idea of personal freedom. Plymouth was not the land of do what you want. It was the land of do what the church wants, or else. Every aspect of daily life was governed by religious expectations. Sunday wasn't just a day of rest. It was a marathon of moral endurance. You were required to attend church services that lasted hours, sometimes 6 hours, with only brief intermissions to stretch your legs and question your life choices. Sleeping during sermons, you could be poked awake with a stick, laughing, suspicious, smiling, reckless, dancing, heretical. Basically, if it felt good, it was a trap. And then there were the blue laws. These weren't just casual suggestions. These were strict rules that regulated behavior with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. No gambling, no swearing, no idleness, and most offensively, no Christmas. Yes, you read that right. Christmas was banned. The Puritans saw it as a frivolous, pagan, Catholic-influenced holiday, full of dangerous things like merriment and roasted goose. Celebrating it could result in fines or even public shaming. Imagine getting punished because someone caught you humming "Deck the Halls" in December. Want a drink to take the edge off? Good luck. Alcohol existed, but drunkenness was deeply frowned upon unless it was for medicinal purposes, which led to a very creative interpretation of illness among the stressed and spiritually exhausted. There was also a strong communal aspect to discipline. Everyone watched everyone. If your neighbor caught you skipping church, using the Lord's name in vain, or heaven forbid, doing something enjoyable on a Sunday, they were encouraged to report you. Public punishments included time in the stocks, fines, or being forced to wear humiliating signs like a real-life scarlet letter. One minute you're milking a goat, the next you're being flogged for picking apples on the Sabbath. Fun was not just discouraged, it was viewed as a threat. Games and theatre were considered a waste of time at best and a gateway to sin at worst. The idea was that idle hands were the devil's workshop, and the devil didn't need any new interns. Still, within this suffocating seriousness, people did find small joys, though you'd be hard-pressed to call them fun by modern standards. Reading the Bible was a popular activity, assuming you were literate. Singing religious hymns was allowed barely, and some people probably cracked a joke here and there, though they likely whispered it into a bucket to avoid scandal. Relationships were strictly controlled, courtship was monitored, and privacy was rare. You couldn't just woo someone with a wink across the village green. You needed permission, supervision, and probably a witness with a clipboard. Even your wedding vows leaned more contractual than romantic. I promise to tolerate you for practical purposes and produce children who will also chop wood. And yet, through this bleak schedule of holy monotony, the settlers persisted, because for all its restrictions, Plymouth offered them something they hadn't had in England, the right to build their version of a godly society. Sure, it involved endless toil and joyless Sundays, but it was theirs. So the next time you complain about your internet being slow or your job being boring, remember the Puritans of Plymouth who banned Christmas, feared smiling, and thought a good time was surviving another sermon without collapsing from dehydration. They were the original rise and grind people. Only instead of motivational podcasts, they had moral panic. Let's get one thing straight. If the Pilgrims of Plymouth Colony could time travel to the modern-day Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade and see themselves represented as smiling, well-fed folk in tidy black outfits with comically oversized hats, they'd probably assume they'd died and gone to some sort of Puritan hell. Because the real story, it's a lot less cranberry-scented and a lot more smallpox-flavored. When the Pilgrims first staggered into history in 1620, they weren't bold visionaries setting out to build a shining city on a hill. They were desperate religious refugees with half a plan, zero survival skills, and a stomach full of questionable hardtack. They nearly didn't make it. Disease, starvation, exposure, and general incompetence nearly wiped them out. And yet, despite their rough beginnings, and because America loves an underdog, these struggling settlers eventually got promoted to founding folk hero status. But that promotion didn't happen overnight. For most of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Pilgrims were just a footnote in colonial history. Jamestown had a more dramatic storyline: cannibalism, tobacco capitalism, Pocahontas, and Plymouth was mostly known for being the spot where people had an unfortunate relationship with scurvy. Even the Mayflower Compact, often cited as an early expression of democratic governance, wasn't seen as that big a deal at the time. It was more like a "we need some rules before Steve steals all the food again" sort of document. So what happened? How did these struggling colonists go from human disaster film to national treasure? Enter the 19th century, where the United States, fresh off a revolution and a few wars, was desperately trying to invent a national identity. What better origin story than a band of plucky, God-fearing folk who crossed an ocean for freedom, shook hands with the locals, and invented Thanksgiving by accident? It was wholesome, dramatic, and best of all could be mythologized beyond recognition. Writers like William Bradford and later 19th century historians and politicians began shaping the Pilgrims into paragons of virtue and perseverance. Their tale was rebranded. Not a group of religious extremists who nearly froze to death in the woods, but the brave founders of American values. The grime, the death, and the absolute misery of their first few years, scrubbed clean in the great soap opera of American storytelling. And then came Thanksgiving, or rather the idea of Thanksgiving. The 1621 harvest feast did happen, yes, and it did include the wampanoag, some venison, and a whole lot of confusion about table manners, but it was not a national holiday. It wasn't even called Thanksgiving. It was just, hey, we didn't die this week. Let's eat something that didn't come out of a wooden barrel. The modern Thanksgiving myth began forming in the 1800s, thanks largely to writer Sarah Josepha Hale, the woman who also wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb, because apparently she liked creating American traditions. She campaigned tirelessly to make Thanksgiving a national holiday, and in 1863, Abraham Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, said, "Sure, why not?" and made it official. Because if there's one thing America needed while tearing itself apart, it was a holiday about gratitude, family, and aggressively overcooked poultry. That's when the legend really crystallized. Schoolbooks started depicting Pilgrims as noble, clean-cut settlers in matching outfits. The Wampanoag were downgraded to helpful side characters in the whitewashed drama, and Thanksgiving became less about historical nuance and more about turkey, televised parades, and bitter arguments over stuffing versus dressing. The gap between myth and reality could not be wider. The real Pilgrims faced unimaginable hardship. They lived short, brutal lives filled with cold, sickness, back-breaking labor, and absolutely no pie. They didn't wear buckles on their hats. That fashion faux pas came later. And their interactions with native peoples were not all warm and fuzzy. They were often awkward, tense, and eventually tragic as colonial expansion and cultural erasure took hold. Yet despite this, their legacy endures, not because of what actually happened, but because of what people wanted to believe happened. They became a symbol, a foundational story, a group of imperfect people who, against all odds, helped spark the long, complicated, often contradictory narrative of what would become the United States. So next time you pass around the gravy boat at Thanksgiving and someone gives a toast to the Pilgrims, you can nod politely and smile, then maybe quietly add, "They were barely functioning colonists who got mythologized into icons. Now please pass the mashed potatoes, because history is messy, myth is convenient, and pilgrim hats, they're pure fiction." Long before the table became a proud centerpiece of domestic civilization, before it held Thanksgiving turkeys, diplomatic treaties, or IKEA regrets, humans ate wherever they could plop down without being eaten themselves. In the prehistoric era, dining furniture was more of a loose concept. A table? That was a flat surface if you were lucky, or just your lap if you weren't. And believe it or not, despite lacking chairs, place settings, or even the faintest idea of fork etiquette, early humans still managed to survive dinner. The miracle. Let's set the scene. You've just spent the last 8 hours stalking a woolly mammoth across a frozen tundra. You are cold, you are tired, and you are, above all, hungry enough to consider chewing on your own shoe if you had shoes. After a successful hunt, your group drags back the meat to your settlement, read collection of rocks near a fire pit, and prepares for a feast. Now where do you dine? The answer, wherever there's not a pointy rock. Seating arrangements weren't assigned, and the nearest flat surface might have been the mammoth itself. Tables didn't exist, but communal dining did. The floor, or dirt, or a nice slab of stone was your table, your bench, and your napkin all in one. Forget placemats. The only decoration at this dinner was a little blood and ash. Bon appetit. The fire pit was the ancient version of a dinner table, or at least the social center of prehistoric dining. It wasn't about haute cuisine. It was about survival, warmth, and chewing without freezing solid. Meals were shared affairs, not because early humans were especially generous, but because dragging a mammoth carcass solo was a bad career move. Fire didn't just cook the food. It lit the scene, kept predators away, and gave everyone something to stare at, awkwardly when someone accidentally dropped a half-cooked rabbit leg into the ashes. There were no courses, no menus, just eat what's here before it gets cold or stolen by that guy from the next tribe. Now, prehistoric dining did come with its own code of conduct. Don't hoard, don't snatch, don't anger the person holding the biggest rock. The host, if we can call them that, was usually the one who made the kill, or at least took credit for it, loud enough that no one argued. And while formal table manners were, let's say, undeveloped, there was still plenty of drama to go around. Who got the best cut of meat? Who was stuck with the gristle? Why did grog always seem to end up with the bone marrow? The social politics of dinner were alive and well, even if the utensils weren't. As for forks, the only fork in sight was the branch someone used to poke the fire. Eventually, as humans became slightly more refined, read, less actively on fire, they started to place food on elevated surfaces. Not because they wanted to dine in style, but because putting meat on the ground attracts bugs and wolves. Flat rocks, logs, and large bones were pressed into service as proto-tables. It wasn't furniture per se, it was just this is the least disgusting place to drop the mammoth steak, but it worked. And from there the slow crawl towards civilization began. Despite the raw conditions, dining wasn't just functional, it was social. Sitting in a circle around the fire wasn't just about warmth, it was about sharing stories, gossiping about the cave next door, and possibly inventing sarcasm when someone burned the mammoth again. In fact, it's likely that language itself began to flourish in these shared mealtimes. There's nothing like being mildly annoyed about someone stealing your portion of roasted squirrel to inspire creative communication. Early humans probably didn't say "pass the salt," but they might have grunted, "not again, dog," with incredible emotional nuance. The table, as an object, had not yet emerged from the Stone Age minds of our ancestors. But the need for it, oh, it was there. Every time someone dropped hot meat into their own lap, or ants swarmed the bone pile, or a helpful child tried to crawl across the dinner zone and took a bite out of the wrong leg, humanity edged closer to one conclusion: we should probably build something to put this food on. The fact that it took a few thousand more years is a testament to just how distracting daily survival could be. Ultimately, the prehistoric table was a metaphorical one. It was the circle around the fire, the place where community formed, stories were shared, and Grog complained again that his portion was smaller than last time. They didn't have oak wood, or legs, or centerpieces, but they had each other, a dead animal, and the occasional log that didn't tip over mid-chew. And honestly, that's more than most modern dinner parties can say. After spending a few thousand years eating hunched over on rocks and squatting in the dirt like thoughtful cavemen yogis, humanity had a breakthrough. What if we put the food on something that isn't the floor? Welcome to Mesopotamia, where civilization got organized, writing was invented, the wheel started spinning, and somewhere in between someone decided that plates shouldn't have to share personal space with one's feet. In ancient Sumer, roughly around 3100 BCE, the table as a concept first started to stretch its newly formed legs. Now, let's be clear, these weren't dining tables in the modern sense. No polished mahogany, no IKEA assembly nightmares. Instead, the earliest tables were often stone platforms or wooden slabs set on legs, and you wouldn't find them in the break room at work or a kitchen corner. These tables were mostly sacred real estate, used not to serve dinner but to serve the gods. That's right, in summer, you didn't eat at the table, the gods did, or at least symbolically. These early raised surfaces were altar-like platforms used for offerings, animal sacrifices, grain, beer, and possibly the world's first recorded plate of "please don't smite us" pastries. In temples across Mesopotamia, you'd find priests carefully placing food on stone or wooden platforms, hoping that if the gods weren't watching, maybe at least they were smelling. It was divine dining, minus the divine digestion. This fusion of furniture and faith wasn't just guesswork. Evidence of tables or things table-adjacent shows up in early Sumerian art and inscriptions. Cuneiform tablets, which ironically were flat objects themselves, describe offerings made on elevated surfaces, sometimes to a dizzying level of bureaucratic detail. Imagine writing down in wedge-shaped script that you'd placed exactly 3 loaves of barley bread, a goat, and 1 polite prayer on a table, and then storing that record for eternity in a temple archive. These people didn't just invent writing, they invented the dinner log. In fact, some of the earliest depictions of tables are not scenes of feasting but of rituals, where the furniture served more as a divine mailbox than a meal station. Statues and carvings show figures placing food or objects on short platforms, while seated gods look on approvingly, or judgingly. It's hard to tell with gods. The height of the table implied importance. Lifting something off the floor gave it spiritual weight. The higher the platform, the more it said, "Hey gods, notice this." Now, were there any secular uses for tables at this stage? Possibly. Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of raised wooden surfaces in elite residences, which might have served as proto-dining tables or workstations. But let's not pretend that the average Mesopotamian family was gathering every evening for dinner and a chat about ziggurat construction. Most people probably still ate while sitting or squatting, holding bowls in their hands and hoping their food didn't fall into the dust. Tables were rare, symbolic and expensive, basically the high-definition flat screens of their day. But even if they weren't eating on them, the idea of separating food from floor had taken root, and in a world that ran on symbolism and ritual, this small architectural decision carried weight. After all, if your entire society is built on the concept of order, from irrigation channels to divinely ranked deities, then elevating your offerings makes perfect sense. Flat things go low, important things go high. And tables? They went right in the middle of temples, surrounded by incense, worship, and probably a lot of awkward chanting. One could argue that the Mesopotamians didn't invent dining tables per se, but they certainly invented the idea of the table as a cultural tool. It was a platform, both literally and metaphorically, to show status, ritual, and eventually functionality. It was a step away from the earth and towards civilization, even if at first it was just used to hand-deliver food to the gods' invisible mouths. And let's not forget the subtle brilliance of this moment in furniture history. Before the Mesopotamians, if you dropped your lamb shank, it hit the ground. After them, it hit the table, and that is progress. Civilization didn't begin with laws or war or money. It began when someone said, "I don't want to eat with the ants anymore." So while Sumer gave us many great things, writing, accounting, irrigation, weirdly intense sculptures of bearded men, let's pause and give credit where it's due. They invented the table. Okay, not our table, but its pious stone-legged ancestor. And in doing so, they gave humanity its first taste of elevated dining, spiritually and structurally. If the Mesopotamians gave us the sacred altar table and the Egyptians gave us elegant minimalism, the Greeks and Romans gave us something far more relatable. A furniture philosophy built around eating, drinking, and never standing up unless absolutely necessary. Welcome to the world of the symposium and the triclinium, where the table wasn't just a surface, it was a lifestyle, a decadent, horizontal, wine-soaked lifestyle. Let's start in ancient Greece, where things got cozy around the clini. This was not a dining chair. This was a sort of elegant daybed for the refined gentleman who wanted to sip wine, nibble olives, and debate the finer points of poetry, all while pretending his back wasn't slowly cramping. The symposium, a core part of Greek elite society, was half dinner party, half philosophical cage match, and wholly a cultural event. At the center of it all, a low table, possibly circular or rectangular, and completely surrounded by reclining men in various stages of intellectual grandeur or wine-fueled rambling. Now, to be clear, this wasn't a casual family meal where everyone shared what they learned at school. The symposium was for the well-off male citizens who could afford to lie around and argue about metaphysics while being served by slaves. Food was the opening act. Some bread, cheeses, perhaps some roasted meats, but the real headliner was wine. Lots of wine. Mixed with water, of course, because drinking it straight was considered barbaric, and consumed in ritualized rounds, often with drinking games like kotabos, where you flung wine dregs across the room at targets. Imagine trying that at your next dinner party and calling it authentic Hellenic ambience. The table itself, known as the trapeza, was low and utilitarian. It wasn't meant for show, it was meant for reach. You weren't sitting politely, you were lounging, propped on one elbow like a sensual statue in mid-snack. The goal wasn't posture, it was pleasure. Food was placed in the center within easy arm's reach of anyone willing to momentarily stop reciting Homer or quoting Plato. And while women weren't typically present at these gatherings, unless they were entertainers or musicians, the layout of the furniture said everything about the exclusivity. Tables were adaptable, moved between guests or even removed after the meal to make room for more philosophizing, or dancing, or general debauchery. But the Romans, of course, saw this setup and said, "Nice start, let's make it bigger, grander, and with more marble." Enter the triclinium, named for its three-couch layout, tris 3, clini couch. The Roman dining room was a carefully orchestrated social performance zone. 3 couches were arranged in a U-shape around a low central table, and everyone reclined facing the food, because what better way to enjoy roast dormouse and fermented fish sauce than while half-sprawled in a tunic? Seating, or rather lounging, was ranked. The host always took the least prestigious position, and guests were assigned spots based on their social status. It was like table seating at a wedding, if the wedding had fewer speeches and more roasted flamingo. The middle couch, left side, that was the top spot, the VIP lounge of the ancient Roman feast. The triclinium wasn't just about comfort, it was about message. To dine reclining meant you were powerful, elite, and had enough free time to digest at a 45-degree angle. No one of significance would be caught sitting to eat. That was for servants. Tables themselves were sturdy, low, and often made from stone, wood, or bronze, sometimes elaborately decorated with inlays or carvings. But again, they weren't the stars. They were the support cast for the real performance, the theatrical excess of Roman dining. And the food? Let's just say it required a certain level of bravery. From jellyfish to so's udder, Roman banquets were culinary carnivals. The table was simply the landing pad for course after course of delicacies, often served between rounds of recitations, music, and drunken toasts to the emperor. So while modern dining emphasizes chairs, manners, and maybe passing the salt, ancient Greek and Roman dining emphasized theatricality, hierarchy, and knowing how to drink while lying down. The table wasn't where you gathered to bond as a family. It was where you demonstrated your status, recited Virgil from memory, and tried not to drop figs into your lap. There's something undeniably fabulous about it all. Sure, lying down to eat a full meal sounds like a chiropractic disaster, but to the ancients, it was the epitome of civilization. Not just eating, but eating in style. Reclined, relaxed, and with a healthy dose of existential conversation, and possibly a burlesque performance by the third course. Next, we'll journey to the medieval period, where tables got long, manners got complicated, and suddenly everyone was obsessed with trenchers, tapestries, and not accidentally stabbing your neighbor with a roast fork. If ancient Greeks and Romans perfected the art of horizontal feasting, the medieval world opted for vertical chaos. Gone were the graceful reclines and carefully curated couches. In their place, long groaning trestle tables, endless trenchers of dubious stew, and a whole lot of elbows. Welcome to the Great Hall, a room filled with food, firelight, and the occasional flying chicken leg. The medieval banquet was a social spectacle and a hygiene hazard. Let's set the scene. A massive, draughty stone hall, with smoke clinging to the rafters like a moody ghost. Tapestries on the walls tried and mostly failed to insulate guests from the cold. In the middle stretched a table so long it probably had its own weather system at either end. This was the classic trestle table, portable, plank-based, and ideal for seating 20 to 200 people, depending on how many peasants you could convince to squish together. The real star of the show wasn't the table itself. It was the seating chart, a masterpiece of medieval power dynamics. Up on a raised platform at one end of the hall sat the high table, where the king, queen, and very important nobles dined beneath an ornamental canopy that screamed, "We're better than you." The closer your seat was to this elevated perch, the higher your rank, and the better your chances of getting meat instead of just turnip water. Everyone else was seated along the length of the hall at lower tables, typically shoulder to shoulder on benches. Personal space was not a thing. Neither, really, was personal hygiene. You were just as likely to be brushing up against a squire as you were a sweating knight who hadn't bathed since Lent. As for the pigs, if you were lucky, they were outside. If you were unlucky, one might be wandering under the table, waiting for scraps, or napping under your feet. The food, though hearty and often excessive in quantity, was not served with our modern ideas of neatness. For starters, no forks. The fork was still centuries away from general acceptance, and when it did arrive, it was greeted with suspicion, as if it were a heretical pitchfork in miniature. Instead, Diners used knives, brought from home, thank you very much, and their fingers. Spoons were available, but mostly for the soft stuff. So yes, everyone was elbow deep in their meal, ideally after muttering a short prayer that they wouldn't catch dysentery from the bread. Speaking of bread, let's talk trenchers. These weren't plates exactly, but rather thick slabs of stale bread that doubled as edible dishware. Your meat, stew, or mystery sauce was plopped onto this yeasty platform, and once the meal was done, or the bread had fully absorbed the grease, you could eat the trencher, or more commonly, donate it to the poor, a noble gesture, assuming the poor were into soggy gravy bread. As for etiquette, it existed, technically. Medieval manuals laid out some charming advice. Don't lick your knife, don't pick your teeth with it either, don't spit across the table, and please stop scratching yourself while people are eating. But just because rules existed, didn't mean people followed them. A banquet could get rowdy fast, especially when the mead and ale flowed freely. This was, after all, a social event and a power display, and the only evening entertainment within a 30-mile radius. Assigned seating was less about logistics and more about hierarchy. You sat where your rank allowed you to sit. A baron wasn't going to rub shoulders with a miller's son. Your proximity to the king wasn't just a dinner perk, it was a political statement. And heaven help the poor soul who accidentally spilled soup on someone more important than them. A stain on someone's sleeve might lead to a duel, or worse, being reassigned to the cold end of the table next to the door where the pigs came in. The table itself was rarely a permanent fixture. Trestle tables could be taken down and stored away, turning the great hall back into a working space. Dining wasn't about comfort, it was about spectacle. Peacocks with feathers reattached post-roast, entire boars with apples in their mouths, towers of marzipan shaped like castles or saints. The more absurd and theatrical the feast, the more powerful the host appeared. Bonus points if your entertainment included a jester, a lute player, or a fire-breathing monk. Yes, really. So while the modern dinner party might come with playlists and Pinterest-worthy table settings, the medieval feast came with social landmines, trenchers instead of plates, and enough grease to oil a small catapult. It was messy, loud, and completely unforgettable. After the glorious mess of medieval banquets where elbows were flying, pigs might have been snoring underfoot, and etiquette was more of a suggestion, the Renaissance swept in like a perfumed breeze through a newly opened dining room window. This was the era where the table stopped being a battlefield for meat and turned into a well-mannered stage for elegance, symmetry, and flexing your wealth with utensils you probably didn't even know how to use properly. Welcome to the Renaissance, the age of rebirth, rediscovery, and most importantly, forks. Let's begin with the setting. Instead of trestle tables that vanished after the feast, wealthy Renaissance households began to favor permanent tables in designated dining rooms, a wild innovation that meant people could sit down to a meal without first needing to assemble furniture like a 15th century IKEA set. These tables were grand, often carved from dark woods and adorned with intricate designs. In short, the table had stopped being just a slab for holding food. It was now a centerpiece, a work of art in itself, and very much part of the performance, and perform they did. You weren't just eating, you were presenting. Dining in Renaissance high society was a choreography of grace, poise, and implied superiority. Meals were carefully structured into multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last, with interludes of entertainment between them, music, poetry recitations, or someone juggling flaming objects weren't out of place between the soup and the roast swan. Because of course the swan was roasted. Peasants had chickens. Nobles had birds that looked like they should be protected by law. What separated the Renaissance dining experience from everything that came before was its refinement, and refinement meant tablecloths, coordinated dishware, and cutlery that multiplied faster than a magician's handkerchiefs. Let's talk about that cutlery. The knife, of course, had long been a dining staple, but now it became sleeker, more pointedly decorative, and then came the fork. Oh yes, the fork finally arrived at the European table, carried in on the silken wave of Italian influence, likely from Byzantium. At first, people were suspicious. Early adopters were mocked. Using a tiny pronged instrument to eat food seemed almost effete. One church leader even called the fork an insult to God's design, since obviously the Almighty had already provided the perfect eating tools, fingers. But fashion is a stubborn beast, and soon everyone who mattered was spearing peas and twirling noodles with giddy precision. The upper class didn't just adopt the fork, they turned it into a statement, gold-plated, pearl-handled, engraved with family crests. Cutlery became both practical and ostentatious, a combination Renaissance elites never tired of. Alongside forks came the rise of fine dining rituals. Napkins, previously something you wiped on your sleeve, became an art form, folded elaborately or even embroidered. Dishes were no longer plopped onto bread trenchers but served on ceramic or pewter plates, sometimes with matching chargers. And then there were tablecloths, bright white and starched to within an inch of their lives. If you didn't stain it with beet juice or duck grease, you were considered a person of control. And candles, oh, there were candles. Not just for seeing, but for setting a mood. Chandeliers dripped wax like gentle timekeepers, while candelabras on the table flickered romantically between platters of roasted pheasant and candied quince. Light became part of the display, an atmospheric touch that could soften your wrinkles and highlight the shine on your freshly imported silverware. All of this performance had a purpose, status. Your table reflected your social standing more than your title ever could. Hosting a dinner party wasn't just about feeding people, it was about dazzling them. Guests would note everything: the number of courses, the quality of the wine, the thread count of your napkins. Did your server announce each course with flair? Did the final dessert arrive in the shape of a mythical beast sculpted from spun sugar? Bravo, Your Grace. Applause between bites was entirely acceptable. Meanwhile, the lower classes looked on from their modest wooden tables. Functional, no-nonsense surfaces tucked into the corners of kitchens. These folks still mostly ate with their hands, maybe a spoon if they were feeling fancy. But even among the less wealthy, Renaissance refinement began to trickle down. Owning a table was no longer just about convenience, it was about aspiration. Everyone wanted a little civility with their stew. So yes, the Renaissance table was where Europe learned that dining could be both a necessity and a spectacle. It marked a shift from sustenance to sophistication, from knives alone to entire cutlery wardrobes, from bread trenchers to decorative platters too pretty to eat off, and thus the table became more than a place to eat. It became a social theatre, a space to perform your best self. Show off your Italian imported forks and prove to everyone that you were civilized now. Thank you very much. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the grand dining tables of the Renaissance elite had settled down. The powdered wigs were gone, thankfully. Forks were no longer controversial, and the concept of dinner as a theatrical performance gave way to something far more radical: the family meal. That's right, enter the kitchen table, the unsung hero of domestic life, the humble four-legged stage where ordinary people ate, laughed, argued, and occasionally used a spoon to discipline rowdy children. The kitchen table didn't boast gold leaf or glistening chandeliers overhead. It wasn't etched with mythological scenes or perched under tapestries, but what it did offer was intimacy, and an unparalleled ability to catch biscuit crumbs in the cracks between the boards. As the middle class began to rise in Europe and North America, so too did the notion of the hearth and home, the ideal of the cozy, moral, industrious household. And sitting right in the heart of it was a plain wooden table, often scrubbed clean with salt and elbow grease. Used so much it was worn smooth by everything from elbows to potato peelers. This wasn't a table you merely dined at. This was a table you lived at. 3 meals a day, or more realistically 2 meals and an assortment of snacks constantly being pilfered by children were served here. Food was rarely extravagant, but it was home-cooked, hearty, and full of moral fiber, literally. Think cabbage, potatoes, stews, and pies, often all on the same plate, blurring together like a culinary watercolor. But meals weren't just about nourishment, they were an opportunity for life lessons. and children seated at the table were expected to absorb more than just gravy. The kitchen table became a lecture podium for parents. You learned to sit up straight. You learned that waste not, want not was a rule, not a suggestion. You were told to finish your vegetables, even if those vegetables had been boiled until they surrendered. In this era, dining was moral instruction with a side of overcooked carrots. And of course, the table was also where the daily news, aka family gossip, was passed around like the breadbasket. Who got a promotion? Who fell into the canal? What Mrs. Havers from down the lane said about your cousin's new dress? No one was safe from a good roasting, and no one was exempt from contributing, even if your only addition was, "Can I be excused?" Dinner was also a chance for confessionals, often unplanned. Children might crack under the pressure of mashed turnips and admit to breaking a window or skipping lessons. Fathers returned from work with tales of unfair bosses, and mothers quietly recounted how Mrs. Plumridge insulted her apple tart at the church bake-off. The kitchen table was less of a piece of furniture and more of a therapist, a court, and a low-stakes battlefield all in one. But food wasn't the only activity. After the dishes were cleared, often with grumbling and minimal cooperation, the table transformed. It became a homework desk, a sewing station, a letter-writing bureau, or even a makeshift surgery site when someone stubbed their toe badly enough. It hosted card games, birthday cakes, and heated debates about who really cheated at dominoes last Christmas. It was also prime real estate for sneaky children. No matter how many chairs were pulled up, there was always one kid who slid under the table, usually with a biscuit in one hand and the family dog in the other. This was the golden triangle of rebellion, hidden from adult eyes, surrounded by table legs, and protected by a fortress of unwashed laundry draped over the chairs. The kitchen table was also the great equalizer. In a time of class divisions and rigid gender roles, it was one of the few spaces where everyone in the household gathered as equals, or at least as equal as Victorian society would allow. Fathers might sit at the head, but mothers ran the show and everyone knew it. Children learned their place, but they also found their voice, especially once pudding was involved. By the mid-19th century, mass production had made kitchen tables more affordable. Furniture catalogues began showcasing family tables in various sizes and styles. Whether you were a shopkeeper in Yorkshire or a farmer in Ohio, chances were you had a table that served as the beating heart of your household, possibly with a permanent dent from Uncle Harold's elbow. While the grand dining tables of nobles still existed, their relevance was fading. The real action, the real life was happening in warm kitchens filled with steam, the smell of baking, and the sound of siblings arguing over who got the biggest slice. So while the kitchen table might lack the grandeur of royal feasts or Renaissance banquets, it revolutionized how we relate to food and to each other. It brought dinner down to earth, literally, with crumbs and all, and grounded it in daily life, shared stories and second helpings. By the 20th century, tables had officially left the house. Gone were the days when the table was just for family meals, spilled gravy, and Dad's mildly threatening monologues about finishing your greens. Now the table put on a tie, entered the workforce, and sat down in a fluorescent-lit room where dreams, deals, and diplomacy all got tangled in the wires of a slide projector. Welcome to the conference table, a flat surface where global alliances, office feuds, startup ideas, and Bob from accounting's retirement cake all share the same uncomfortable space. The transition wasn't sudden. As governments expanded, corporations ballooned, and the world became addicted to paperwork, there needed to be a central piece of furniture where decisions could be made, coffee could be spilled, and everyone could pretend to take notes. Enter the boardroom table, often long, often polished, often so intimidating that new hires avoided making direct eye contact with it for their first 6 months. The conference table became the altar of capitalism and diplomacy. From smoke-filled rooms of 1920s finance moguls to today's open-plan, glass-walled strategy dens, this was where fortunes were made, empires were planned, and someone always forgot to mute themselves on Zoom. And while the kitchen table had once been a place for passive-aggressive comments, the conference table perfected them. Let's take this offline. became modern code for please never bring this up again. And per my last email wasn't just an email phrase. It was a vibe echoed across polished wood surfaces with tight smiles and even tighter deadlines. These tables weren't just for business. In government buildings around the world, they became the tools of statecraft. Think of the Cold War, a global standoff defined by nuclear brinkmanship, ideological tension, and an oval table. Yes, the Oval Office wasn't just a quirk of architecture. It was a symbol, a signal that the United States was diplomatic, thoughtful, and good at drawing curves. Round tables made sure no one sat at the head, which was perfect when you didn't want Khrushchev to feel like he was being condescended to, or condescending too hard in return. During peace treaties, summits, or UN negotiations, table shape was deadly serious business. Rectangular tables? Someone always got the power seat. Circular ones? Everyone's equal, and equally suspicious. Even the height and distance between chairs could be cause for a diplomatic meltdown. In one famous example, a disagreement over who sat where at the 1960 Paris summit almost derailed the whole thing. Because nothing says peace in our time like arguing over seat cushions. Back in the office world, the conference table had its own dramas, particularly in the form of the meeting. If the medieval banquet was about stuffing your face while impressing your lord, the corporate meeting was about looking alert while your soul quietly left your body. At least medieval feasts had roast pigs and wine. Conference tables offered stale coffee and someone's leftover donut from marketing's last budget cut celebration. Still, the table remained central to corporate mythology. You weren't just in the meeting, you were at the table. And to be invited to that table, that meant you mattered. You had input, you had responsibility, or at the very least, you had to nod solemnly and pretend to understand the Q3 projections. Technology didn't help. First it was overhead projectors, then those dreaded PowerPoint presentations, which turned the table into a battleground of bullet points. Each click of the remote was a step deeper into charts, graphs, and the occasional inspirational quote that no one asked for. The phrase "let's circle back" might sound casual, but it was the conference table equivalent of prepare for 17 more slides about projected growth. But it wasn't all doom and numbers. The table was also where office cultures were built. Birthday cakes appeared, followed by plastic knives no one wanted to use. Interns nervously took notes with pens that didn't work, and someone always brought a new idea that either revolutionized the company or got quietly deleted from the minutes. In the 21st century, the conference table became hybrid. Virtual meetings changed the way people gathered, but the old table still stuck around. It evolved into Zoom backgrounds, half-eaten snacks left after lunch and learns, and that one guy who insisted on standing during every meeting for posture. Symbolically, the conference table captured the modern tension between collaboration and competition. Everyone was seated, but no one fully trusted what was being passed across the table, especially if it came with a quarterly report attached. Still, for all its flaws, the table remains the nucleus of workplace theatre. It's where interns become managers, managers become memes, and memes become case studies. Whether you're launching a billion-dollar startup or trying to convince Sharon from logistics that your idea actually is good, it all happens at the same table, probably with bad coffee and zero legroom. So next time you're seated at a conference table staring at a whiteboard and wondering if time has stopped, remember you're part of a long, strange tradition. From royal feasts to passive-aggressive PowerPoint slides, the table has always been there, watching silently and judging your font choices. Behold the modern table, sleeker, cheaper, and 75% more likely to collapse if you sneeze near it. Gone are the days of heavy oak behemoths passed down for generations, scratched by time and family drama. Today's tables arrive in flat cardboard boxes, come with instructions written in an ancient Nordic riddle, and can be assembled only if you possess a hex key, eternal patience, and perhaps a minor engineering degree. Welcome to the IKEA age, where a table is less a piece of furniture and more a relationship test. Assemble it with a partner and you'll either emerge stronger or single. The modern table is humble, minimalist, and held together by small wooden pegs that seem like they came from a dollhouse. It's not built for eternity, just for the next lease agreement. But it's not just design that's changed. It's how we use tables. In a culture now fueled by convenience and screen time, the classic sit-down family dinner is on life support. Instead of gathering around a table to break bread and make eye contact, modern mealtimes often take place on the couch. One person scrolling TikTok, another deep in an existential Netflix spiral, and a third having a Zoom meeting with their boss while spooning pad thai into their face. The kitchen table, once a warm hearth of domestic routine, is now cluttered with unopened mail, dying succulents, half-finished puzzles, and that one pen that doesn't work but no one throws away. It holds everything, except dinner. Then there's the coffee table, that mysterious low-lying rectangle in your living room that was supposed to hold coffee but instead supports a curious collection of remote controls, coasters, unread magazines, and possibly one sock that's lost its partner. It's become less a functional piece of furniture and more of a cultural diorama, a shrine to the chaos of daily life. And let's not forget the standing desk, the ergonomic rebellion of the 21st century. This table has one job: keep your spine aligned while you slowly lose your mind in Excel. It's the fitness tracker of furniture, always reminding you that sitting is the new smoking, even though standing for 8 hours a day makes you long for the sweet release of a chair, or a nap, or death. Of course, the biggest revolution in modern table culture is the Zoom table, a surface where work, leisure, parenting, and mild panic all take place at once. In the age of remote work, the table has become your office, your cafeteria, your conference room, and sometimes your therapy couch. If the medieval table held goblets and roasted meats, today's table holds a webcam, cold coffee, and the crushing pressure to look productive while your cat walks across the keyboard. The pandemic only accelerated this transformation. Dining tables became classrooms. Desks became dinner spots. The lines between work and home, once enforced by the ritual of commuting, disappeared, and suddenly we were all living our lives on top of the same cheap particle board. One moment you're eating a burrito, the next you're giving a presentation, and 5 minutes later you're crying into a spreadsheet while reheating the same burrito. Meanwhile, folding tables rose to prominence, the ultimate symbol of our flexible pop-up lifestyles. Whether it's a makeshift buffet, an emergency poker game, or a side hustle's packaging station, the folding table is always ready to disappoint you with its wobbly legs and cheap plastic charm. It's the Swiss Army knife of modern adulthood, useful, unstable, and slightly embarrassing. But here's the twist. Despite their downgraded status, tables are still central to our lives. We still gather around them, even if virtually. We still decorate them with candles and holiday centerpieces we forget to remove until March. We still lean on them when we're tired, rest our heads on them when we've had enough, and curse them when we stub a toe. Yes, they may be flimsier now. They may be overrun with cables and crumbs. They may be built from MDF and held together by sheer willpower, but they're still there, quietly witnessing our digital meetings, our solo dinners, our Sunday craft projects, and our Tuesday takeout orders. The modern table no longer demands reverence. It doesn't host royal banquets or diplomatic summits. Instead, it says, "I'm here if you need me," for eating, typing, crying, or building a model of a spaceship while avoiding your taxes. It's a new era, one where tables don't define status or ceremony. They reflect real life, messy, multi-purpose, frequently uneven, and so we salute the modern table. You may be assembled with 47 screws and questionable instructions. You may wobble under pressure, but you hold up what matters: laptops, leftovers, and the ever-crushing weight of late-stage capitalism. That's pretty noble, for a piece of furniture that came with 2 missing bolts.